4. And before we begin, I would like our Madam Clerk to call us to order. I'm calling us to order. If you would please call the roll call.
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Steve Leonardis.
Here.
Councilmember Marcia Jensen. Councilmember Barbara Spector.
Here.
Vice Mayor Rob Rennie.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Mariko Sayoc.
Here. And let the record show that our council member, Marcia Jensen, does have an excused absence for tonight. Okay. And so at the beginning of every meeting, we have, it is a great pleasure for us to introduce to the community a stellar young adult, young child that comes forward and leads us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And so at this time, if I could ask Yilian Yuan to come join me up here. I have to make sure that everyone can see her. So Yilian is a first grader at Dave's Avenue, and she enjoys gymnastics, musical theater, reading, writing, and science. And she actually volunteers also and has been volunteering since 2016 at local beach cleanups on Earth Day. So I'd like for all of you to meet Yilian, and I would like all of you to join us as we do the Pledge of Allegiance tonight. Here she go. So ask them to stand. Okay, go for
I
it.
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much. Let's give her a round of applause. Speaking for someone that is up here on a regular basis, it takes a lot of courage to come up here. So again, thank you, and thank you to the parents for bringing her tonight. So April is Poetry Month, and we have two wonderful things in store for you. Tonight, we are going to hear from our town poet laureate. And at our next meeting, you will actually hear from some students who have created poetry for the month. But if I can ask Mr. Stan Garber to come forward. How many of you actually knew we had a poet laureate? Very cool. So, Mr. Garber, I would like to share with you a proclamation whereas National Poetry Month seeks to highlight the extraordinary legacy and ongoing achievement of poets, introduce people to the pleasure and benefits of reading poetry, and brings poets and poetry to the public in innovative ways, and make poetry an important part of our children's lives. Whereas Town of Los Gatos has appointed Stan Garber as Poet Laureate, and Mr. Garber is engaged in efforts to make poetry an essential part of the arts and humanities in Los Gatos, affecting every aspect of life in Los Gatos, including education, the economy, and community pride. And for that I can attest, you have been wonderful in sharing your love for poetry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. An honor. Thank you. I can't even begin to tell you how excited I am to be the town poet. It's a dream of mine, and I can't even compose poetry to describe how excited I am about it. And I've come here I have one poem I'd like to read to you, and I want it to be meaningful. Like, I want it to be interesting. And so my poetry is like storytelling variety. I like to tell a story. And I actually like to tell a story and then end it with a poem, so that's what I intend to do. So that's my father. okay? Howard Garber. I grew up in his house, and he was, what can you tell from that picture? He's kind of a strict guy, okay? And like he wasn't the easiest guy to have as a father, but like he thought that if he was really strict with me, I would grow up upstanding and be a school principal, maybe even a town poet, right? So then, yeah. So can you switch it to the other picture? Or there you go. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. So this is me, okay? I'm not so sure I needed a dad so mean, but that's just what I got, okay? That's just how it was, okay? So that's kind of like there's like a confluence of the story. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it was 3 years ago. I'm principal of Cabrillo Middle School in Santa Clara. It's the 49er STEM Leadership Institute. I just love being the principal of the school. So a man who didn't like me very much, he accused me of misappropriating the carnival money. He did this thing. And he sent an email to everybody, to the county board of education and the school district, and it was, I didn't do this thing. Like I didn't run away with the carnival money. And so I had to defend myself, and I had to go to school board meetings, and I had to stand at the podium, and I had to explain to everybody that I'm not a thief and I wouldn't take the carnival money. I had to do this, right? So I'm still the principal, so obviously I didn't do this thing, right? And I got an apology note from the school board, and I was completely acquitted and vindicated, but it really hurt. Like this whole thing, like this being accused thing, it was bad, right? So then I did a bad thing. And the bad thing I did was I got so stressed out that I started smoking. I would go down the San Tomas Expressway, and I would sneak a cigarette. I would do this. Not that it's illegal or anything, but I started smoking. I got so stressed out by it. So next thing I knew, I got this pain in my arm. And it was it scared me because it wasn't like anything I'd had before, and it wasn't like a pulled muscle. It was something bad. I knew it. So I had to go to the doctor. I hate going to the doctor. Okay, so I go to the doctor. He runs me through all these tests, and he pulls me into his office, and he sits down. He says, "You're going to die." He says, "We could do surgery on you this week, and we could fix you, and you'll be just fine. But if you don't do this thing, you're going to have a heart attack, and you're going to die." So, in complete disbelief, I fired him, and I got a new doctor. "No, you're wrong. I'm not going to die, right?" So I went to the second doctor, and he ran me through the same tests. It was horrible. And he said, no, Dr. A was right. You're going to die. So then I left the office, and I went downstairs, and I was standing in front of this medical office, and I had this moment. And I thought to myself, I don't have time for this. I can't take time off of work for this. I'm a school principal. I have all this stuff to do, and I don't have time for this. And that's when I realized that I was completely insane. That my job or whatever meant more to me than my health, I guess, And so at that point, I've always wanted to take those two ideas, like my father and how he treated me, little Stanley, and this thing that happened to me, and I wanted to blend it into a poem, and I did it. And I wrote this poem called No Time to Die, and that's what I want to share with you, okay? It's important to me. And ever since I've been the town poet, I've written some of my best poetry. It's been such an inspiring experience, and so it's been wonderful for me. But anyway, No Time to Die. I had the meanest dad in the neighborhood when I was a kid. I don't know why, but I swear I just did. He was abusive to me, but much worse to others, my mother, of course, my sisters and brothers. Because I looked like him, he cut me slack. So when he got mad, I could take a step back and head for the door, because you know where that led. I went to school to shake off the dread. And that's where I stayed pretty much my whole life. It was safe and secure like the arms of a wife. And I wonder if I'm the only one with that story, because this is America. Things get kind of gory. And then one day, I got a pain in my arm. I knew what it was. Time to go by the farm. But Doc said, don't worry, you don't have to cry. I said, Doc, I'm too busy. I got no time to die. I got meetings to go to. There's no sub for me. I got to go now to a tough IEP. And that's what it hit me, what my father had done. He'd strangled my spirit while the neighbors had fun. And I hated him so until that moment in time. But I think that I'm healing through words and through rhyme. And those teachers who saved me, they came up so huge. And I thank you, America,
School was my refuge.
Okay, so that's yours. This is yours, and thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Schultz, closed session report for tonight?
Yes, good evening. Council met in closed session before the regular session, and there's no action that was taken that requires reporting.
Okay. Thank you. At this time, I'll ask all the council members to report on activities where they had represented the town since our last public hearing. Councilmember Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor. Since our last meeting, I attended the Finance Committee meeting, and we will be discussing that item later on this evening.
Okay. And actually, I'm going to turn to Councilmember Spector because I seem to have lost my own notes, and so I'm going to jot that down real quick.
All right, I can speak really slowly. Since the last meeting, I've had meetings with members of the Los Gatos Development and Commercial Real Estate, and I also had a meeting yesterday along with Mr. Rennie of the Parking and Infrastructure Ad Hoc Committee to discuss a potential parking garage in downtown.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In addition to what Ms. Spector said, I also attended the Finance Committee with Mr. Leonardis on 323. On 324, I attended with the mayor. Here's one for help you out. We attended the elected roundtable discussion about affordable housing sponsored by Silicon Valley at Home. And we shared, everybody shared their challenges, I guess. Also on 324, I, as part of my role as a LAFCO commissioner appointed by the Cities Association, I met with applicant that was interested in the annexation of property into Montecito. I also met with, on 328, again, another person, a couple people interested in annexations of property into the town of Morgan Hill. And there were also some discussion about ag preservation in the Morgan Hill area. On 328, the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority had its executive committee meeting. And then yesterday, the Silicon Valley Clean Energy had their kickoff. We flipped the switch and are now providing 100% carbon-free energy to a third of our users, which is 68,000 users. And the mayor attended that event, and I, as chair of the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority, got to speak at that. And today I also had lunch with the Silicon Valley Clean Energy CEO to plan our next board meeting.
Thank you. Since our last public hearing, the West Valley managers and mayors met to discuss a variety of issues, but the issue of concern was we had a discussion with the VTA CEO to just talk about Next Network, which is the proposed plan for bus routes and future ways to provide transit to our community that will not be using the bus route. The ribbon cutting for Cycle Bar was held in the past 2 weeks. And if many of you have noticed how clean the interchange at Highway 17 and 9 is, that's due to efforts of several volunteers that cleaned up on a Saturday. And we had Lexington fifth graders here recently in these chambers to talk about our 5 sister cities and view the various gifts that are available in the lobby. And as the Vice Mayor said, yesterday was the kickoff for the Silicon Valley Clean Energy, and it's an exciting time, and thank you for chairing that effort for us. So, Ms. Pravetti, do you have a report for us?
I do. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite our community to join us for our annual Spring into Green Festival. It will be held on Sunday, April 23rd. In the morning, we will also be hearing from our mayor, our state of the town. All of the presentations will be at 11:30, and there'll be rock climbing and a lot of other fun activities. So please join us. And then we are still accepting applications for the Youth Commission. We have lots of openings, so we're really encouraging high school students and middle school students to apply. The deadline is April 28th. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we have 6 items on our consent agenda. These are items that will be decided on in one motion unless it is pulled. No one from the council member has pulled any of the items, and I am looking to the audience if anyone would like to. Seeing none from the council, do I have a motion for items 1 through 6 on consent? Yes, Council Member Spector?
Yes, move to approve the consent items.
Okay.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? It passes unanimously. We are now at verbal communications, and this is your opportunity to speak on an item that is not on our agenda. I currently have 1 speaker card, and that is from Ms. Angelia Dorner.
Hello, I'm Angelia Dorner, proud resident of the Almond Grove. I just wanted to give some closing comments on the 2 consent items that were pulled last meeting concerning the annual street project. And I think it's very important that we all make a distinction between the budgetary and PCI data, which is provided by staff in the staff report and their responses, versus the engineer's estimate, which is used to get approval to the bid. The staff report and responses regarding budget needs and PCIs were from the QES report, which was 1 year and 9 months old, had not been updated. The question that was asked by one of you regarding Broadway and Bachman, if that update had been done, you were told it was not really significant, but you forgot to ask about the $1.6 million of other residential streets that were done. So they really didn't have to respond about that. I questioned this QES statement in the report that said maintenance and rehab history data had been updated. That was always in my mind of why that wasn't already done when the work was done. And then when Lisa's response regarding updated said updated based on the requirements for updating these PCIs, I wondered what requirements. So I approached Matt at break to see if they were even able to update Street Saver. He said they were updated. So I was shocked, and I asked, then why did you give the council old information? If you did update this for all the work that was done last summer, why didn't you give them the new PCIs and the new information as far as budgetary needs? I didn't really get an answer, and so I was hoping someone might be able to tell me why this would be considered acceptable. This budgetary information forms the foundation of your decisions on how and where we spend money. I did provide an analysis of the mechanics behind Street Saver to all of you previously, and I'm not going to go through any of that detail, except I am awaiting confirmation on whether there really is weighting or not on the arterial, which is significant, and the level of traffic on the streets in the Street Saver database are just totally extreme variations. Also, Mr. Rennie, about a year ago when you and I met at Dolce Spazio to discuss last year's project, you had mentioned to me that Matt said that we were trying to catch up on some of the old issues because some of the work that was done in the past wasn't necessarily what should have been done or that level. So these are the kinds of questions, if we have a study session regarding PCIs, that I think need to be answered. The only thing that I want to mention as far as engineer's estimate is thank you so much for providing some level of accountability by requesting this information. And I also just wanted to point out that one item in the engineer's estimate made no sense to me at all. Staff costs $291. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dorner. And Ms. Pravetti, since our last meeting, it was not part of the motion, but one of the things that I had suggested was individual council members work with you on the level of detail that should be provided in staff report, and I know I myself have done that, and to provide, there's a right balance between providing significant detail and not, and I know that we're trying to find that balance. So if you have any insights you'd like to share, but I know that we've talked at length about how to better communicate the information available.
Yes, and I think you'll see some of our attempts at that for an item later on this evening, so that way you can connect the dots and follow the dollars throughout an entire project. But that is something that we're happy to continue to work on with all of the council.
Madam Mayor, please note this one last thing. We have a finance committee now, so those members might be able to.
I'm sorry, Ms. Dorner. Your time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you. You may talk to the finance committee. Okay, that concludes verbal communications, and we now begin our public hearings. Our first agenda item is item 7 under other business, which is to approve an amendment to an employment agreement between the town of Los Gatos and our town manager.
Good evening. Thank you. Lisa Velasco, Human Resources Director. Before you tonight is a recommendation to formally approve an amendment to the Town Manager's Employment Agreement. In compliance with Senate Bill 1436, a summary of the modifications to the amendment include an increase in base salary to $212,000 annually and a one-time lump sum performance bonus of $3,000. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Council members, any questions? Okay, this is a public hearing, so if anyone would like to speak on this matter, you may do so, but I have no cards. So seeing none, I look to council for any comments or a motion. Council members, Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor. I move the approval in the staff report to approve the amendment to the employment agreement as found in attachment 1 between the town of Los Gatos and the town manager.
Okay, do I have a second?
I'll second.
Vice Mayor seconds. Any comments to the motion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Velasco. We're now at item number 8, which is to review and discuss recommended strategies by the Council Finance Committee to address our public employees' retirement system pension. Welcome, Director Conway.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. Tonight, the town council's expanded finance committee had a very productive first meeting last month. We have a number of our committee members here this evening. For your consideration this evening are 2 recommendations from our first meeting. The first is to issue an RFP to financial vendors who specialize in administering Section 115 IRS pension trusts, used as one tool to help the town address its unfunded pension liabilities. And the second recommendation is to authorize staff to budget an immediate payment of $1 million to be paid from the town's general fund CalPERS/OPEB reserve and be placed in the town's OPEB trust account. This $1 million payment will add approximately $1 million to the approximate $10.7 million in the trust as of today's date, bringing that balance to about $11.7 million. The $1 million payment is expected to reap total interest savings, assuming a discount rate of 7.5%, of approximately $2.5 million over the remaining amortization period. So that's a significant savings that the town will expect to achieve. The Finance Committee is continuing its hard work on the unfunded pension and OPEB liabilities, and it has its next meeting will continue its deliberations on this subject, and we'll be working on further recommendations to the full council. Our next meeting is scheduled for May 4th, 2017. If there are any questions, I am happy to answer them at this time.
Thank you, Director. Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Conway, on page 5 of attachment 1, you have a table of the funded percentages of our 3 plans, which are the miscellaneous, the safety, and the OPEB plan. And you state that best practices is to get to 80% funded, and our safety plan currently says 78%. Our miscellaneous plan says 73%, and our OPEB said 48%. So we just added $1 million to the OPEB. Any idea what percentage? 2-part question. What percentage does that bring us to, if you have an idea or don't? And is 80% also best practice for an OPEB type fund?
I can answer the second question right off the top of my head because for OPEB and pension, GFOA has a recommended practice that governments maintain an 80% funding level for any sort of post-retirement benefit. So it would be applicable either to OPEB or the pension. Currently, we have a approximately $12 million unfunded liability in the OPEB plan. So if we made we're dropping that another $1 million, drop that to $11 million. So that's approximately a 10% reduction. So I would expect we would be close to a 58% funding level just with this one payment.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Conway, on page 3 of the staff report, there is a discussion of information, elements of vendor proposals. The issue was what is or is not public information. And there was reference to information which is proprietary. And I was just curious as to what type of information would be proprietary and therefore not public.
Excuse me, could you please point me to that? Okay.
It specifically says non-proprietary elements of the vendor proposals would be public information.
That would be our pricing. Yeah. We're going to be sending, when we issue an RFP, we may have 4 or 5 firms that we will be responding to the town, and these firms have trust products where they would hold the investments for our pensions, and we would structure an appropriate investment strategy and criteria for that fund. Each of those funds has different costs that they will charge the town to in the form of basis points. And during the negotiation period, the town will have some give and take going back with each of these vendors saying, if we were to place X dollars in trust and you were managing X dollars, we would expect the fees would be commensurate and, would be adjusted. The more money you have that under administration, the fees would be, it's a negotiation, so we were referring to that negotiation process. Once we have a firm recommended and we recommend it to the full council and the committee has recommended that going forward, we will of course disclose all terms of the agreement in terms of the investment strategy, the fees that we would be paying the selected vendor, et cetera. It was more for the negotiation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any further questions? Okay. Well, then at this time, I will again open it up to the public if anyone would like to speak to this item. Seeing none, I'll close the public testimony and I'll look to council for further questions and or comment or a motion. Councilmember Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Sayoc. As the chair of the Finance Committee, I just want to say thank you to the Finance Committee members who were newly appointed. You guys did such a fantastic job at our meeting and bringing your thoughts and knowledge to help us arrive at this conclusion this evening. And thank you to the staff for the extensive reports and all the options. And I look forward to this developing over time, us being able to address this even better than we did with this latest round in the future as we gain more information on this issue. And with that, I will go ahead and make the motion to move forward with the staff recommendations A and B on page 1 of the staff report, which is to issue the RFP for the Section 115 IRS Pension Trust, and then authorize the additional $1 million to be put into the OPEB Trust.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any comments or questions? I just wanted to comment that not being present at the Finance Committee, I appreciate the staff report and the listing of the various pros and cons. I know it's a very complex issue, which is why we've enlisted several residents in our community to assist us with this endeavor. And I appreciate the information up front and the ability to think through the various alternatives and look forward to further information as that develops. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor. I'll just add, as a Finance Committee member, for those in the audience, I don't think it was really mentioned, but we had $2.3 million in our fund, and we decided at this point to go ahead with $1 million in the OPEB and leave some, because we're still thinking through and investigating different ideas to leave something, is the 115 trust the right way to go, or we're exploring other options. So that's why we kind of split the money and save some for, if we have, as we develop our ideas.
Thank you. Okay. I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Passes unanimously 4-0. Moving right along, we are now at item number 9, which is 91 and 101 West Main Street. Due to the items on tonight's agenda, I had asked that this be recommended to be heard on April 18. Do we actually need to create a motion to have this moved officially? Okay. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Given what the mayor said and how many things we have on our agenda this evening, I am going to move to continue agenda item 9, which is 91 and 101 West Main Street, to our next meeting, which would be April 18th.
I'll second the motion. Any comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Passes unanimously 4-0. And we will hear this item on April 18th. I don't believe it will be renoticed. Is that correct, Mr. Schultz?
That is correct.
Okay. So if anyone would like to speak on this item, we'll see you here on April 18th. Thank you, Ms. Hope. We now move to 15215 Shannon Road. It's a plan development application, PD-15-001, mitigated negative declaration ND-15-001, APN number 537-25-002. Just a reminder, we began this hearing at our last meeting, and we did close our public testimony. What we continued to tonight's meeting is the deliberation, further question, and hopefully come to some resolution for a motion tonight. Ms. Armour, would you like to give us a brief recap of where we are and any information that has transpired since the last 2 weeks?
Yes, good evening. You've actually covered most of what I was going to include in my staff presentation. Staff did provide some additional information to try and clarify what the role of the planned development zone is and what the opportunities are in making a determination on this application this evening, hopefully. But beyond that, staff is available to answer questions. We also have staff from the Parks and Public Works Department, and we are all happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And since we did close last time we did close public testimony, if we could just share disclosures from that any information that was not available to the other council members that you feel should be shared. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. As a member of the CDAC, when this matter came before the CDAC, I took the opportunity to drive Shannon Road and then approach the property up the existing roadway up to the property itself. And so I was able to deal with that one roadway and see the property, which is level when you get up to the top. This time around, when it was now before the council, I drove to the, can't remember what the name of the other street is, but the other proposed access way, went all the way to the end of that roadway and then observed the property and the steepness from the current roadway to the property itself. And I should also say, both for the CDAC and for the council consideration, I did meet with the applicant and his architect.
Okay, thank you, council member. Vice Mayor, any disclosures?
Thank you, Mayor. So many months ago, the applicant asked me to come up long before it came, before it even went to Planning Commission, the applicant asked me to meet with him at his residence, which was the one existing house. So I did drive up the Shannon Road access, which is something that's been of discussion, and I got a tour of the property, including where the road would be cut through from the Highlands development, and I saw the 5 sites that they had, flat sites on the top of the ridge that they had proposed as building sites. I can't say that it, other than visually, I mean, I don't know how to share what I saw more than that.
Thank you. I'll also share that I've also been on site. I believe I had the same tour that was provided by the applicant. Access was via Shannon Road, and looked at the 5 proposed individual lots, as well as a video of the visual aesthetic that such a subdivision would provide. Councilmember Leonardis?
Thank you, Mayor. I have nothing to disclose.
Okay, so staff, I'm sorry, council members, any questions of staff? Okay, so seeing none, I'm going to direct us to page 3 of the staff report. There are since our last meeting, there were various issues that came up, and so the issues were addressed in a Q&A style, but at the very end on page 3 was a suggestion on how to tackle such a large development. The first question was, is the proposed zone change from pre-zone HR5 to HR 2.5 PD appropriate? I'd like to hear any council members' thoughts on either we can begin this way, or if anyone would like to share any specific comments, feel free to do so. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. If I could ask staff's assistance in putting the colored plot that's sitting next to the projector over there, and possibly stand next to it and point to things. Thank you. So that didn't show up very well. The blue is not showing up on the projector, huh? So,
if you know what you want the blue highlighted?
That showed up much better.
Perfect.
That worked great. So this, I looked at this. So one of the questions was whether we should be HR5 or HR 2.5. So I believe the red is the property that's we're discussing. Blue is HR 2.5. The green is the resource conservation areas. And the hashed areas are still in the county. Tell me if I'm wrong at some point, staff. And then the yellow areas that don't have hashes are the HR5 that are in the town ourselves. So one of the justifications that the Planning Commission suggested was that HR5 is not appropriate because you should have HR5 next to research conservation. So first thing I said, well, what does the town look like? Well, when I look, first of all, the property is surrounded either by resource conservation or the blue, which is HR 2.5. So then I said, okay, it was suggested, well, if you're close to resource conservation, a HR 5 is more appropriate. A resource conservation means you can't really build on it, or whatever's there is there. I'm not sure I have the definition exactly correct, but close enough. So if I look, where do we have HR 5? Well, there isn't HR 5 surrounding the resource conservation areas except what's hashed in the county, and that's just because that's an automatic pre-zone. So if you look at what's in the town, we've got a little bit of HR 5, there, but it's not really related to resource conservation. It's kind of close. There's a little piece that's close to it down here, but I fail to see the justification that HR 5 should be next to resource conservation, because I don't really see that predominantly on here. I fail to see that this property should be HR 5 when it's surrounded by HR 2.5, even though it also is next to the resource conservation. Hopefully I made the points correct. So,
okay. Any further comments on this? I'm sorry, Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I felt as though since you were looking this way, I should say something. I remember that my other site inspection was from Santella Way. In any event, this application was one of the examples of how a site inspection was extremely important to my analysis. The Vice Mayor was looking at the zoning and the types of zoning that surrounded the property. What was significant to me was the first time that I went up on the property, which was before the CDAC meeting, and that I drove up the road/easement to the property itself. And it was the most level property that I have ever visited in the hillsides, either as someone who was visiting a friend or a council member or planning commissioner who was visiting sites. It was very, very level, and in that regard, I felt as though it was appropriate for additional housing. Having said that, then the issue for me becomes how much housing. And again, given the fact that the site is so level, given the fact that it is so large, I know we're going to be going down, there's no motion pending, but I would be comfortable with the HR 2.5 PD.
Vice Mayor?
If I could just add a little bit. So I'm basically agreeing that HR 2.5, I'm not yet saying that the PD is what we should do, or that 5 is the right number of lots to have on this property. I'm still open for discussion. I just feel that it would be unfair to say that it has to be HR 5. There isn't a justification for it.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and share my thoughts on this. And again, sticking to the larger issue of HR 5 to HR 2.5, and I will have to agree with Councilmember Spector. A site inspection on the site was what really swayed my opinion. On paper, if I saw that there was a proposed zone change from one to another, just on paper, in theory, I would say why. There's no justification. But having been on the site and seeing the proposed building pads and the ability to develop, without saying how many, but the ability to develop on parcels that are naturally flat in a hillside area, did sway me to think that additional buildings could be built. And I know we'll get into that conversation of how many is appropriate. But at this point, I feel comfortable with the conversion from HR 5 to 2.5. Okay. So with that said, so now we get into if a zone change is appropriate, how many lots? And I think that's a discussion that we still have further discussion on. And would any council member like to weigh in on that? So, Vice Mayor.
I think I'd maybe like to ask some more questions of staff. So we know from last time we were told if you want the 5, you have to have a PD. That's absolutely required. I think there's a stigma against PDs. We try not to do them. So I've tried to understand what can be done without a PD. So I asked the question, I think last time, or did I? It was so late and it was short. I don't remember if I asked or not. But if we zone 2.5 and we don't do a PD, your staff report said, can we do that? And you said, no, it's not appropriate for the project. I'm assuming you mean no because it doesn't allow 5 units that they're asking for. Is there another reason it's not appropriate?
So the zoning HR 2.5 allows up to 5 units on this parcel. However, to do a 5-unit subdivision, you have to have a PD zone. So doing just the straight zoning, they would not be able to do the full 5 lots because it would require a PD zone. In addition to that, without the planned development zoning, they would not be able to do the private roadway that they are proposing.
So if I could just follow up on so that was really sort of the next part of the question. If we didn't want to give them a PD, you're saying there's no way they could do the private road. And that if you say, so basically let me put it another way. So I think we determined if you use the existing road, there can't be more than 2 units, correct?
Correct.
So if we wanted more than 2, or we wanted to allow more than 2 units, we'd have to build a road.
Correct.
Or we could widen the existing one, but the neighbor's already, that the easement goes through, the neighbor already stated during the Planning Commission testimony that he wouldn't allow additional easement, so it's very problematic. So to go beyond 2, we almost have to build a road in from the Highlands. And you're saying now if we have to build a road, we absolutely have to be a PD.
For a private roadway, it needs to be done through the plan development zoning process.
Okay, thank you.
So I wanted to follow up on that. Is there a reason why it has to be a private roadway other than we wouldn't want to maintain that responsibility ourselves?
And I can jump in here. So one would be the maintenance of that and the connection to Santella through a couple other private properties. The other is the width required for a public street in the hillsides is a minimum of 24 feet paved. So you're going to have additional grading, additional retaining wall height, and then additional tree impacts, generally if you have to have a wider road than what they're currently proposing.
And I have more of a process legal question. Assuming we did a PD overlay, if we were to take the step and rezone it and you provide a PD overlay and homes are built at a later time, is there, does a certain amount of time is there a vesting time requirement with a PD overlay?
There is not a vesting, excuse me, I'll jump in here. Sorry, Jennifer. There is not a vesting time. This is a legislative act, so you're changing the zoning. It is good in perpetuity or until someone modifies the zoning.
To make sure I understand, so it would stay HR 2.5 as the zone, and then we would provide a PD overlay that would provide the private road. But other than that, there are no really other exceptions that, other than the grading that we'll get into, that would be a benefit to a PD.
There are other benefits to a PD, and you'll probably get into this later, but the nice thing about a PD is that you can tailor it to the specific geography and natural resources on the site. So if you had concerns about maximum house size or number of trees to be removed at the time of home development or maximum height, you can add additional provisions to the proposed ordinance to make sure that it has all of the protections that you would like for the property.
Okay, and a future ANS would then have to follow everything that was delineated, that we listed in the PD overlay.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, any further questions? Okay, any further comments then on the idea of lots, whether it's 5 versus the 1 or somewhere in between? Councilmember Spector?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Again, based upon the size of the lot, of the property, the dimensions and size of the flat portion up at the top, I'm interested in what other council members have to say. But this is probably the only time in my history where I would say that the number of lots being requested is appropriate.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor Sayak. I, from my tour up there, I agree that it seemed like there is 5 appropriate flat lot sites. They all seem to be, they were all either behind a ridge or had a lot of tree screening, so I think when the visibility issue comes up, I have a sense that if the houses are going to do well. The applicant removed the request for higher than 18 feet, so higher often causes more visibility to occur, so that seems like it's better. But in terms of the number of lots, I think I mentioned before, my one concern would be Lot 1, because the area in Lot 1 is smaller and more tree. The other thing we learned last time was up to a 5,000 square foot house doesn't even need to go to Planning Commission. A 5,000 square foot house doesn't look like it would fit on Lot 1 without wiping out more trees than maybe we want to occur. So I would say I wouldn't necessarily eliminate Lot 1, making it 4 lots, but I might limit the size of the house in Lot 1 or require, no matter the size of the house, that it go to Planning Commission, or require not more than 2 or 3 trees be removed from any given lot as part of PD conditions.
Councilwoman Spector?
Thank you. Question of staff. we received additional information from the applicant, one of which was graphics with the lots, and one of them is Lot 1. And the Lot 1 has the LRDA, and it also has, now this is where we get to the question. As I look at this, it has one tree removed on the access route within the lot, and then 3 on the housing site. Am I reading that correctly?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, so
you can see it there.
If it were this design, and I would like A&S to probably go to the Planning Commission, but put that aside. Whoever is doing the A&S, if they looked at this proposal, it would be removing 4 trees, and they might be able to do other things.
Correct.
Thank you.
Actually, I do have a couple of questions for staff. Since one of the issues that has come up, not only at the last hearing, but in written documentation submitted, is just the drainage issues. And, you know, there's a notion that you can engineer to fix things almost to a certain extent. But at this point, with the environmental studies that have been done, one is, do we have a geotechnical report that was done to show what the soil material is and how to adequately engineer or improve the site to capture whatever drainage issues could happen from those homes, regardless of number?
Yes, we actually did have the applicant go into significant detail in terms of providing the design for how that drainage would be accomplished. And that was part of the environmental review. It's one of the attachments to the initial study that was prepared. I'm going to see if anyone from our Parks and Public Works Department has anything to add.
Hi, Kevin Bagley, Engineering. Yes, the site was reviewed for stormwater compliance and reviewed by our peer consultant as well. Peer consultant agreed with the applicant's consultant that the stormwater would be reduced leaving the site from all watersheds.
And so a follow-up to that, and that includes the proposed access that's coming from Centella?
Correct. The proposed access would be treated as well.
Okay, and then the second question is, so given there was written material submitted detailing the storms that we've had and the severity of this storm compared to past, remind me, in the calculations, when you're doing the stormwater, what are you calculating for? What's the worst case scenario that you engineer for?
The town standard, similar to other municipalities, is a 10-year storm, but the applicant reviewed both the 5, 10, 20-year storms, larger storms, and concluded that there was reduced runoff for all these storms, the ones we require, and larger storms.
And so if I'm hearing correctly, then whatever is included in our mitigated neg deck includes for a 20-year storm?
Correct.
Okay, so that answers that. And then my next question of staff is with regard to the access. So the environmental studies looked at the environmental consequences of the access road from Centella. Did it do a comparison of what scenario A, using Centella, versus Shannon Road, the existing road?
The environmental analysis was based on the proposed project, which was to build this new private roadway and to keep the existing driveway as an emergency access, a secondary, but none of the environmental review relied on that. It did not compare the two options.
And is there a reason why?
There were no unavoidable impacts found from the proposed project. And so I'm seeing nodding. I'll let Joel add to that.
Sure, and I think the other thing, and I know this came up in some correspondence, and I also spoke with the writer of that document. And so the town, through CEQA, is not required to study alternatives. when we have a mitigated negative declaration, we are only studying the potential impacts of the proposed project. It's when we get to a project that triggers an environmental impact report where alternatives are actually required. So if we had gotten to that point, which we did not in this instance, then we would have done alternatives, one of which could have been that scenario of upgrading the existing access to meet fire standards and then looking at those access impacts and deciding whether those were less or more than the proposed project. So alternatives generally are only studied when we're looking at an EIR, and this did not trigger an EIR.
Okay, council members, any Vice Mayor?
Thank you. I'll ask some more questions. So the applicant submitted, as Ms. Spector pointed out, the suggested build site limitations for each of the lots. Has staff looked at those, and do you have any comments about whether they're reasonable, viable? And my first question really is, so they've drawn circles around the trees and they've drawn a build site around that. Is that adequate to make sure the trees aren't affected by the construction?
When a new application comes in for a new home, we definitely would want a more detailed analysis of potential impacts on the trees. Whether a building went on all sides, in some cases this area does go on more than one side of a tree, and so that can have greater impacts than if it was just on one side. So this is not a detailed analysis, so it's hard to say what those impacts would actually
So
be.
if I could follow up, just understanding a little more. So this build site, is this going to be there shouldn't be much grading, but maybe there's a little bit to flatten things for the house. Does this mean the grading won't go outside that blue line also?
If this buildable area were incorporated into the plan development zoning designation and rules, then I would advise you specify that be the limit to all site work, so that grading and house construction would all be kept within that area.
Thank you. Let me follow up on that because I want to make sure I understand it. I'm looking at the diagram that's up on the wall there. And right now, at this juncture, this application, I don't think, has an LRDA or a specific building site. Or are you saying that this is it?
Actually, I believe one of the pages in the development plans that were provided to you did show the LRDA for the site as a whole, and so can be seen for each individual site. I don't believe this matches it exactly, but it does have overlap.
And
I think this is a subsection.
Yeah, if I could just offer, they've pulled out the individual lots, and so if you notice the area that is in green, that actually depicts the LRDA, and then they have a smaller subset of that, which is showing what they're proposing as the potential allowable building area.
And so, question for staff is, if we were going to move forward, would we be moving forward with a PD that designates this lot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as these have been presented to us in the past week? Or what?
One of the options that you have to choose tonight is whether you would like to add anything to the draft plan development zone that has been provided with your staff report materials. If you are interested in including these further restrictions as shown in the diagrams provided by the applicant, that could be added, but it is not currently listed as a condition within the PD.
Thank you.
Follow up and push a little bit. So if I think you stated it, we could use these allowable build areas as the maximum that they can go for grading and all house building activities, but it doesn't mean that. But then you said you would still like to review tree impacts, so you might actually, after review, pull it back from some of the trees. Is that correct?
Correct. So this gives a certain buffer around the trees that they are showing would be retained, but a more detailed tree analysis with a proposed building footprint and grading would be included in each of the architecture and site applications.
So if I could just restate again, we could say something like this is the maximum allowable but not necessarily entitled area.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to, write that down, Vice Mayor. I'm going to turn to page 2 of the staff report, question 2, where it says, can the council approve this with up to 5 lots in the tentative map determine the final number? What are the benefits of just rezoning it now and having the Planning Commission go through the tentative map process? Would there be more studies that would be undertaken that could help guide whether the question of 1 to 5 lots, what would be the benefit of number 2?
There are some additional details that would be included as part of a tentative map application, but the information that you have at this point is pretty close to what would be reviewed at that time.
Okay, and then a follow-up to that is the question with regard to the trees, where it says the proposed PD to limit the number of tree removals associated with the proposed home site. I mean, all our guidelines say to limit the amount of trees to be removed. So how would this further limit that? Would we state specifically which trees not to touch, or would the next process identify that?
There are probably a couple different ways that you could move forward in terms of protecting trees. If there are particular trees you want to make sure are maintained, that's one way to list it. Another option would be to say no more than the 4 trees shown on the exhibit provided by the applicant would be allowed removed on lot 1. Or another option would be to be more general, just to say that there would be a number cap, but not specify which trees.
Which trees. And should we move forward with this PD and each individual home then comes through their ARC and site, if our visual analysis or any other policies change, would they have to follow the new policies, or because of the PD date, which date would rule over the ARC and site?
The application date for the architecture and site application.
Okay. Any further questions, Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor Stack. I wanted to address the road. So I think staff has spent some time working with the applicant on the road, and there was, I guess, 2 road locations considered. The first one, it took out less trees. Did that? It took out. Let me restate. It took out more trees. Did that road location, was it compliant to maximum retaining walls and fill and cut?
So there are 2 alternatives that I think have been discussed in some detail for the roadway location. One of them brings it pretty close to meeting the retaining wall and grading requirements, but it still would need minor exceptions. But it does increase significantly the number of trees that would be impacted. So there are exceptions either way.
Engineer, want to make a comment?
I just agree with Jennifer on what she said.
So staff has worked, and you feel that the actual proposed road, the one that takes out less trees, is the best option that we could do if we're building more than 2 units on this site.
Staff did recommend the project to Planning Commission.
Thank you.
I have to go back to the drainage issues. Walk me through the process. Assuming a PD is approved, the lots are designated, is there a constant check on how much runoff is actually produced at each step of the way? Or do you do your calculations now based on these plans, and is there any fine-tuning later in the process? And the context behind that is I am concerned with the amount of runoff that could occur given how much we're going from one home on 13 acres to a possible 5 homes. So just explain that process and how you can catch and correct as you go along through the process.
So the treatment required would be assessed during the ANS process based off the impervious area that was added. And obviously the treatment facilities would have to be maintained, and maybe planning can comment on how that maintenance would be set up. But the amount that would be required for treatment would be set during the ANS.
And if I could just add that our stormwater permit is very strict in that we're not allowed to have any net new runoff leave the site at all. So we have to find solutions so that all water can be treated on site and infiltrate on site.
Ms. Peterson, I see you have the mic.
Yes, thank you. Lisa Peterson, town engineer. And I do also want to state that for each residence that would be built, we would have a stormwater maintenance agreement that has to be signed by that property owner. And per our permit with the water board, we are required actually to do inspections on all of the, we call them low impact development facilities, such as the ones that they're proposing here, at certain periods of time, basically into perpetuity.
And so even once a building permit is issued, there's still a requirement on the town to maintain?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments? Okay. And would anyone like to venture towards thoughts that lead to a motion? Councilwoman Spector?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Gather together all these pieces of paper. This is a motion. I'm going to move adoption of a mitigated negative declaration and adoption of a mitigation monitoring and reporting program. Further move for a plan development rezoning of the property from HR 5 to HR 5.5 PD to allow for subdivision of 1 lot into 5 lots, construction of 4 new single-family homes, and removal of some trees, and I'll get to that in a minute. Further, as part of the motion, I will make the findings contained in Attachment 9 relating to CEQA. I'll just adopt everything in Attachment 9, but relating to CEQA, relating to required consistency with the town's general plan, required compliance with hillside development standards and guidelines, compliance with the hillside specific plan, and required and consistency with the town's housing element. I would move to adopt the ordinance contained in Attachment 7 with the modification that paragraph 5, which deals with architecture and site approval, be modified to require that, to mandate that the buildings be no higher than, taller than 18 feet, that ANS be determined, reviewed by the Planning Commission, that for any lot, the fewest trees as possible be removed, especially as it relates to lot number 1, that the access be from Santella, and the reason for that, as far as I'm concerned, is having driven the road from Shannon and listening to the Planning Commission testimony as to the potential limitations on that road. understanding that it is in areas greater than 20, what is it? The slope, the density, the slope, yes, is greater than 20. And with regard to the road that is being proposed, understanding that it is requesting some exceptions, that those exceptions are addressing reducing the amount of grade, reducing the amount of off-haul, and reducing the number of trees to be removed. I'm sure there are things I may have forgotten, but I'm willing to consider anything that others have to say.
Thank you, Mayor Sachs. So one clarification. I believe you misspoke. You said a rezoning from 5 to 5.5. I believe you meant rezone from HR 5 to HR 2.5.
You're absolutely right.
So I'll go ahead and second that, and then, but also make a suggestion. There was some concern about, a lot of construction traffic coming through the Highlands. Would we want to limit construction traffic to the Shannon Road, except for, say, big graders or something that can't come up?
I am not prepared to make that part of my motion now, but I would certainly look to staff for their input on that issue.
And I did second that, by the way.
Any further comments?
Thank you, Lisa Peterson, Town Engineer. That's certainly something that we can look at with the developer and assess the best methods of getting the trucks up there. Certainly, there could be some issues with the access off of Shannon due to the steepness of the grade. As was mentioned, there is one location there that it is almost 30%. So that could really preclude some equipment from going up there. But we'd certainly work with the developer to make sure the impact was as minimal as possible.
Yes, Councilmember Spector.
With that input, I would amend my motion to include that all development, construction, traffic, off-hauling be assessed by the staff, and that the developer be required to comply with whatever staff's determination may be.
That amendment's acceptable to the seconder.
Just a couple of questions of staff with regard to this. So I just want to make sure I understand. So with this motion, it will then change the zoning from HR 5 to HR 2.5 PD, but there still is the next step, which involves the tentative map, and then after that involves the architecture and site.
As well as annexation.
So annexation actually occurs next?
The annexation would be required prior to recordation of the map. They could start the subdivision map process, but it could not be recorded as a subdivision until the annexation is complete.
Okay. Any, yes, Councilmember Spector?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is a question of staff also. I did reference the ordinance attachment 7. Should I read the entire title at this point? Or is the clerk going to do that? Should the motion pass or before the motion is adopted?
After the motion passes, the clerk will read the title.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and weigh in on the subject. As you can probably hear, considering the questions involved, my largest concern with this issue is specific to the drainage as well as the access. I think I've mentioned earlier that if you go on site and you see where the proposed lots are going to be, there seems to be a natural pad already there on where the homes are. I feel comfortable that with architecture and site, the issues with hillside visibility as well with a tree could be substantially mitigated. And I keep going back to, even if it's one home, even if it's 2, 3, 4, or 5, we still have access issues. And is that a significant enough issue for me to deny the entire project? That's where I'm at right now. And at this point, based on the testimony that I've heard tonight, as well as what's been presented to us, I do think there are significant staff issues that have gone into that access road, and I think I would be supporting the motion. So any further comments? Okay, I'll call the question then. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, it passes unanimously 4-0.
So I'll read the title of the ordinance.
Okay, yes, thank
Ordinance
you.
of the Town of Los Gatos amending the town code affecting a zone change from HR 5 pre-zone to HR 2.5 PD for property located at 15215 Shannon Road.
Okay, thank you. And we now move to item number 11, cut through traffic. Director Morley.
A trifecta tonight: traffic, parking, development, all at once. So at our priority sitting session in January, we had a discussion about what we were looking forward to in the coming year. One of those items was continuing to address our cut through traffic. As the council is aware, we've got a permit process that we're working on with Caltrans to be able to explore a permanent traffic circle at the intersection of Wood Road and South Santa Cruz Avenue that would facilitate ongoing closures of Highway 17 in a little easier fashion than what we're currently working on. And that design process is in the process now. Looking forward to this summer, we wanted to be able to get up and running with traffic control leading into Memorial Day and taking us through Labor Day. In order to do that, a council identified this as a priority and recommended that we set aside $300,000 from our capital program for next year. We're asking tonight that the council front load that into this current year. The funds are available in the town's budget to be able to do so. That will allow us to do the implementation in May, which is before the new fiscal year. So it's moving those dollars a little bit more forward in time and allowing us to begin work. In addition, tonight we're also asking for approval of plans and specifications, which essentially brings forward the same traffic control plan that we implemented last summer. The traffic control plan includes the traffic circle at Wood Road that still provides access to Wood Road, allows us to turn cars around at that point in a somewhat smooth fashion, and still allows folks to exit Highway 17 headed northbound if they want to come into the downtown. We also have included the same amount of advanced notification throughout the town, so the changeable message signs, the detour signs, so that traffic, should it end up in our local streets, has that notice that the road is closed ahead, and hopefully we can continue the successes that we ended the summer with last year in limiting the cut-through traffic through the downtown. One of the things that we are exploring this year is not closing the access to the Almond Grove through Masal and Tate from Highway 9. We want to see how that works for us. We had talked about it last year, but actually never left those open for the cut-through traffic. Our theory at this point is that should there be no reason to cut through that direction, that traffic won't cut through there. Obviously, we'll want to watch that, and we can change direction on that one fairly easily if our theory does prove to be incorrect. We also will watch Ridgecrest in Montsereno and work closely with Montsereno should that be an area that we need to address into the summer. So a little bit of work and ongoing monitoring. We also would like to continue our data collection. We're not asking for approval of that other than we've identified the financial allocations for that that we'd be expending. The dollar amounts are within the town manager's authority, so we would enter into a contract for data collection similar to what we've done in the past summer. Wanted to take a few minutes and talk about the financials because this is the staff memo where we've changed the financial table a little bit, and we wanted to walk through that with you and hopefully provide a little bit of explanation to what we're doing and get any feedback on whether this helps with clarity or not. So to start, our engineer's estimate for the traffic control element is $182,000 and change. We're asking for approval, town manager authority to award a contract up to $200,000. That allows us a little bit of flexibility should the bids come in a little higher than our engineer's estimate. Typically, we do this with through the addition of a contingency and approval to the budgeted amount. But since the budgeted amount is that full $300,000, or the request is that full $300,000, we really wanted you to have that the visibility of what that cap is. We've also identified data collection estimated at approximately $30,000, and of course that will be driven by the quotes when we quote that element, and staffing costs of $20,000 to help us cover the costs of being here on the weekends and managing the project. If we turn to the financial table that's on page 5, it's a lot different format, and this is a little bit of a unique project because it's covering 2 fiscal years, and we're moving dollars into this new fiscal year, so it provides all kinds of complexities. So maybe a good opportunity to really dig in on that. So I'm going to take you through that financial table, sort of line by line. The first line is budgeted funds from the current fiscal year, and we budgeted $215,000 for cut through traffic, and that's out of the budget book, so so you can track the dollars there. In the course of the year, on that same column, we added down 3 lines. We added $900, and that was in order to facilitate the contract with W-Trans that we approved in January. W-Trans is the company that's doing the permitting, the design and permitting with us on Caltrans. So the budgeted numbers are there on that left-hand column, and the relevant expenditures are on the right-hand side. So we show the expenditures through the summer for cut-through traffic and the $66,000, which is the contract amount with W-Trans. You can see that the total current activity zeroes out. There's expenditures that equal the budgeted funds on that middle gray line there, total current activity. Then we come down to the next section of the table, which identifies a recommended additional appropriation of $300,000. Those are the funds that we currently have in the town budget that would typically fall into the GFAR for allocation for next year. If you recall, when we finish a fiscal year, so when we finished 15-16, we had a year-end fund balance. We hone in those dollars, or the finance department hones in those dollars over the course of 6 or 7 months, and that comes to council through the year-end cleanup, typically I think in the December timeframe. So it has a little bit of a lag, and then those funds rest there until they're reprogrammed the next budget cycle into the GFAR or other priorities that the council might have, and that's how we fund our capital program, through those fund balance dollars at the end of every fiscal year. And again, they sit there for a year. They gather interest over that time, but they're unallocated at that point. So that's why we have the funds available to be able to allocate the $300,000. It would take $300,000 away, to be clear. It would take $300,000 away from our GFAR allocation for next year. So you're preempting your decision a little bit if you make this decision tonight. So I want to make sure that you understand that taken from your priorities, our recommendation is that this is a good expenditure of the dollars, but it does take away some flexibility for the future. We do have a recommended contract authority moving down the lines of $200,000, as I explained earlier, and then the 2 other allocations of $30,000 and $20,000. You can see on the bottom line there that the total budgeted amount is $525,000 rounded, and the expenditures are $475,000. So that leaves us a little bit of extra funds in that particular case. And you can see by the footnote that should we have funds left over at the end of the year, those funds would roll into the next fiscal year. So these would roll into 17-18, and they would be tracked in the budget through that process. You wouldn't see those funds tracked through the budget process this year because we won't know what's expended until June 30th, by which point you've already made decisions on next year's budget. So you'll see these the result of these expenditures either through reports that staff provides to you, or through the year-end cleanup when we do that. In addition, if there's any funds, so we have an engineer's estimate of $180,000 for the project expense. Should that come in under, or should we not expend all of those funds would also go to the rollover into next year. And of course, the manager has the authority up to $50,000 to enter contracts, and anything above that we would come to you for approval of. In addition to that, any change orders to the traffic control that we might need over the course of the summer, we would bring to you. So you would see all of those changes because they are above the authority. So this is a little different look at the financial table. We tried to step it through sort of line by line and make it clear. I'm definitely interested in feedback on this or additional information that the council might be interested in. And with that will conclude my staff report.
Thank you. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Sack. On page 3, you talk about data collection. So my question, I guess I don't need to know exactly where you're going to do all the data collection, but what is your philosophy? Is that going to include some of route north of 9? Obviously, there'll be some south of 9. What's at least your philosophy for that?
So we want to replicate the data collection we've done in the past so that we have continuous data that gathers over time. So we'll be doing video collection in the same intersections, and we'll be doing hose counts in the same locations. So we want to be able to do apples to apples comparisons over time. So that's important. We are working on. In the past, we've done some vehicle timing. So we've had actually a car that's been out there tracking time from one point to the other. It gets a little cumbersome in the traffic, in that it's not a super efficient way of tracking your drive time. We're working on some technology-based solutions for that, using actually the culprit that is causing part of this problem, ways that may be able to provide us some data out of their system that provides drive time information. My hope is that we have some more in-depth information on the impacts on drive time through town at the end of summer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Morley, one of the things that came up in the communications we received, and also that I had in my mind based upon last year's experience, is given that we may be moving forward this evening and you are suggesting May, starting in May and going through September, do you have any thoughts about how we can standardize and publicize our process so that it will be better known to the greater community?
So with many of our projects, we've increased the outreach through social media. We can certainly bring that forward. So we have Nextdoor, which has become very effective for us, and we can utilize that more, as well as our What's New on our town website and our Facebook pages. So we can start to do some more social media outreach. I've had a question already from the Mercury on what we're doing this summer, so we may be able to get some help from them as well in terms of getting the information out there on what we're doing.
Any thoughts about, I understand getting it out to our community, which the things that you've just identified would tend to do, except for the Mercury. Any thoughts about how we can allow, like when I say the greater community, we can allow the people from San Francisco, Cupertino, other areas, let them know that they are no longer able to cut through our town?
So I'm certainly open to suggestions. I think that using Roadshow is going to be one of the more effective ways. I think that's a fairly well-read column. And since I have that inquiry already, I can and a connection there, I can make that outreach. If there's other suggestions from the council, I'm certainly willing to include those in the work that we do over the coming summer.
If I could just add, in the past we've done press releases, and it has been picked up by the Bay Area news agencies and television, and so we could also use that route to try and get the word out to the bigger region.
If I could just follow up on that specifically, what about the mapping apps themselves? Is there a way to show or to alert them that during the summer weekends, should this be approved, they will be closed? That seems to be the largest contributor to the traffic congestion.
Yeah, I agree with you there. We were successful, I think, in the sort of midterm last year, getting the mapping apps on board. I think our lessons learned from last year were that Apple and Google are a little bit more difficult to connect with, and so we'll work hard to get them the information early, so they have that and they can add it to their maps. Our experiences were that happened last year. They added it to the mapping program. They program it in so that it shows up during the hours that the streets are closed, and that helped tremendously. Waze is a little easier. We actually have access to program the closures ourselves, so we can put those in proactively and make sure that they're in there and that they stay.
Thank you, Mayor Sack. I can't find it in here, but I thought I remembered reading that you said you were going to have it closed weekends from Memorial Day through Labor Day. And is that correct?
That's correct.
And so in the past, we had talked about alternatives to closing it, such as street fairs, that Fiesta de Arts, and generating some other events that closed Santa Cruz. But my understanding was when we closed Santa Cruz, we were going to leave it open to see what the effect was. So this information seems to be in conflict with what we talked about before.
Yeah, so that's one of the things we've been kicking around and struggling with a little bit. If we close Santa Cruz, so if we close Santa Cruz, for example, between Main Street and Highway 9 at the extreme, or through some segment of that, there's still sneak around routes. So through Almond Grove, using Broadway extension, coming down University and up Main to past the post office, that kind of a thing. My expectation would be, with the technology and the mapping apps, that they would figure that out, and we would have still a challenge managing the traffic. So from that, we explored the potential opportunity of taking it down even further to the end of Montebello Broadway, to try extending the closure there. At that point, we really run into some trouble handling traffic that comes off of Highway 17 headed northbound, and to accommodate that, we still leave a little loop around, a little escape for the traffic that might cut through. So we haven't come up with a great solution. We certainly, I think, to the extent that we're closing the Santa Cruz on the weekends for events, I think that's still a good thing and a reason for folks to come downtown, which is a lot of what the drive, I think, behind that. So to balance the difficulty in getting to the downtown with the enticement of actually being there for a particular event.
Thank you.
Okay. At this time, we are available to hear from the public on this matter. We have received lots of correspondence via email and written, but I have no cards from anyone who would like to speak. Unless I see anyone moving forward. I'm sorry. If you would like, we won't, because this is recorded, we can't hear you from there. You are able to come, and if you have any specific questions, they won't be directly answered, but during our deliberations, we'll be able to get some of the answers to your questions.
Okay, just to be clear,
and if you could just identify yourself.
I'm sorry, Christy Niemeyer. I was under the impression that it was mentioned that they were going to be closed weekends, but I was under the impression it was just portions of the day on Saturday and Sunday. That's what I would like clarity on, the hours of the closure. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, and Ms. Niemeyer, if you could just fill out a card so we have that in our records. Thank you. Anyone else would like to speak? Okay, so thank you. And if you could just identify yourself before you're speaking.
My name's Jim Fuller. I live on one of those streets where cars stack up.
And I'm sorry, if you could speak in the microphone, that'd be great.
I live on one of the streets where the cars stack up. One of the alternative streets to going through North Santa Cruz through the downtown area. From what I heard just now from the discussion, having walked through that whole neighborhood at the times in question, and doing an informal interview with drivers sitting in traffic, walking down to the roundabout there at Wood Road. The idea of not coning off Mazola and Tate, that could lead to a day of catastrophe, like the first day that we had that coning the roundabout, which made things worse that one day, which gave this whole plan a bad idea, or a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. One of the surprising things I found in talking to drivers sitting in cars is that maybe 1 in 20 was using Waze. Most people were using Google Maps, who actually owns Waze. Most were using Google Maps, and then in-car GPS systems that are tied to OnStar and other real-time services. The other thing, having done the walking around that I've done, the idea of closing North Santa Cruz and not the alternate streets, that's going to be a mess. I mean, from what I can see. The discussion about whether or not to close that ramp or other parts, if you refer to, I think it's post like 62 on the current next door discussion, you'll see an explanation of why closing that on-ramp or closing the Highway 9 eastbound to 17 South on-ramp doesn't make any difference. They're a wash. The only difference is you've got a workable downtown area or one that's suffering gridlock. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr.? Okay. Any other speakers?
Hi, I'm Pamela Pridemore. I live in the mountains. I first apologize for all the noise I made when I came in. Couple of things. Has any statistics been gathered before you've closed down North Santa Cruz, the exit, and after, for last year, to see if there actually was any impact, positive or negative, to closing down that area? And if you are going to close it down, I'd like to know what the times are, so that if I choose to hang out in town a little bit longer, so then I can take that exit. Because last year I didn't realize it was closed at one point, and I went to go out that way, and it kind of pissed me off that I live, 5 minutes away, and I couldn't leave town. I had to deal with gridlock traffic to go the other direction, to deal with gridlock traffic to get on the freeway to go home. So, however you tried to pass the information off to let the people who live in the area know, I didn't know, and I know a lot of people where I live did not know. So I found it to be a really major inconvenience in many ways. And what I did experience downtown was just gridlock. So who's going to want to come to Los Gatos if it's that bad? I think you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot by doing it. So anyway, thank you.
And any questions? Thank you. Anyone else would like to speak? Okay. Seeing none, I'm closing public testimony, and then I turn to council members. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. A couple questions of staff. First of all, I know we haven't voted on this yet, but what is staff's proposal as to the timing on Saturday and Sunday of the closure?
The proposal is consistent with the previous year's timing, which is 9 a.m. to 3 p.m.
Saturday and Sunday.
Saturday and Sunday, and holidays. Thank you.
And then a question: what are your thoughts about having a different process on the very first weekend in terms of Tate and Masol? And I think I heard maybe at the very start those streets should be protected, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
So the reason that we've talked many times about Tate and Masol and leaving them open or closing them has been sort of this push and pull from the residents of the Almond Grove and being able to readily access the neighborhood. So we think that leaving them open provides some of that access. And then if you do just a sort of a quick thought through what the advantage of somebody turning right off of Highway 9 onto Tate or Masol might be, there's not a lot of advantage to that in terms of getting ahead of the queue. So the cut through traffic may be minimized. There is a risk to it. We acknowledge that, and that's why we'd want to watch it. We do think it's worth trying to see what the long-term impacts of that are, considering that in the future, if you're thinking out when a permanent roundabout is in place, we're trying to minimize the ongoing costs of a closure, and being able to leave Tate and Massal open would be an integral part of that.
And so just to follow up on that then, your comment that we'll be watching it during the entire summer period as we're collecting information, obviously that helps fine tune and give us more data. If we just see that keeping Massal and Tate is a disaster, there's an ability midway to fix Massal and Tate and put a traffic stop there, or is it all or nothing tonight?
There is absolutely, we can change midstream. We can, even if it makes the council more comfortable, we can stage it so that it's the equipment is there, and we can change midstream on a particular day.
Thank you.
If I could just add, though, that there are implications not just for our Parks and Public Works staff, but also for our police department. Because we are not asking for any augmentation in terms of traffic enforcement. So we would have to manage traffic within all the other priority calls that we're dealing with. Last summer, we were able to do that balancing act, but I just want to caution that we would have to be considering the law enforcement side of this as well as just the barricade side.
If I could add some, even with the closure at Tate and Massal, there are parking lots that allow for that sort of bypassing the cut through. So it hasn't, even with the closure, hasn't been a fully successful way of keeping folks out. It does certainly minimize the impact, which is really one of our big goals is minimizing the impact townwide.
Any further questions? Okay, seeing no questions, any comments? And anyone like to venture into a motion? Councilmember Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Sayak. I move that we approve the 3 items A through C on the staff report. Page 1.
Second.
Okay. Any comments? So I just want to make a brief comment because I know we have gotten several correspondence, not only from people in town as well as through the mountains, and just to reinforce that this is one step of many that the town is trying to relieve the congestion all over town. And I know there's no perfect solution. People have suggested various ways, and I think our primary purpose in tonight's decision is collecting more data, because a long-term solution will require a traffic study to be presented to Caltrans, and that we hope with the data that we receive this summer as well as last, that when we do have to make the final decision, it's supported by actual traffic studies and data points, and that in no way are we trying to protect one neighborhood over another, but try and figure out the best way to alleviate congestion throughout our town. So with that, I'll call the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously 4-0. Thank you. And we now move to item 12 on our agenda. Okay. So, Mr. Schultz, before I introduce this, if you could just remind us from a legal standpoint our reconsideration process.
So this is up for reconsideration based on your last meeting. There was a motion for reconsideration which passed, so now you're reconsidering your last motion. You can take public testimony on your motion for reconsideration and then decide what you want to do. The motion being reconsidered is the entire motion. It can't be piecemealed out. There were some questions of whether the motion made for reconsideration only dealt with the Alpine, but at the meeting where this was passed, it was a motion that included all 4 different components of a staff report. So all of those are up for reconsideration because the motion has to be considered entirely that was made at that time. As you move forward with this, if there's a part that you want to rescind, you would rescind your previous motion and then make a new motion. Or it could state that even though you've now done a motion for reconsideration, doesn't mean that you have to rescind your last motion.
Any questions on that, Councilmember Spector?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Since this is coming back to us, I want to make sure that, at least for myself, I understand what it is we're doing and what it is we might or might not be changing. And so with that in mind, I am looking at the staff's recommendation, and it starts with this: discontinue the neighborhood parking plan process. I actually don't know what you mean by that. So if somebody can explain that to me. I'm assuming you're saying that nobody else in the town can ever apply for a parking permit area, but maybe that's not it.
That is correct, actually. That was the recommendation coming out of our policy committee, that based on the recent petitions for preferential parking, most of them were really addressing quality of life issues as opposed to other types of issues that were the original intent for preferential parking. And given that it's not a cost recovery program for the town, we feel that it's most effective, and the policy committee vetted this, that we address the real issue that's confronting our town, which is high school parking. And so that's why you have the package of recommendations before you to really address the streets around the high school. If there are other streets within the town, north, south, east, west, where residents have concerns, we would certainly want them to communicate those to our Department of Parks and Public Works. We would still evaluate them, but there may be solutions other than parking to address the root cause of the concern of the neighborhood.
So if somebody, let's just be ridiculous and say on Lark or Winchester or the Boulevard, if some neighborhood abutting those streets in the future has a situation come up where they thought that permit parking might help their neighborhood, they would no longer be able to ask the town for that process.
That's correct, but again, we would be very open to looking at what the root cause that's motivating the concern, to see if there might be some other solutions to bring forward for either council consideration or something our town engineer might be able to just implement.
All right, then you have as a recommendation number 3, expand and rename the east side parking permit area to the high school zone. And is that an area that currently has permit parking, or some that has it, some that does not, and some that hasn't even asked for it?
There is a map in your packet, and I'll ask staff to put it up on the screen, and then I'll ask Lieutenant Langer to walk through the streets. I don't know if we can make that just a teeny bit bigger. We can walk through the streets that already have parking restrictions as well as permit parking and what the new areas would be.
And before the thing that I personally am most interested in is those areas to which the recommendation is they be given permit parking and they haven't even asked for it.
Thank you. So currently, streets that currently have permit parking in the east side area would be Villa Avenue, Jackson Street, Alpine Avenue, Johnson Avenue, Crossway, Whitney Avenue, and Bella Vista Avenue. And those are the streets that currently have permit parking. What we're recommending to expand the zone is to expand Johnson Avenue up to Foster, is to include Loma Alta up to Alta Heights, is to extend Bella Vista from Charles to a half-mile point near Bella Vista Court, is to include Charles Street, Wheeler Avenue, and Stacia Suite. We're going to look at Simon's Way, but technically it doesn't look like there's going to be room for any permit parking on Simon's Way. We're going to ask Pleasant Street if they would like permit parking as well. And all these streets that I've just mentioned, we're going to ask them if they want permit parking before we just implement it. They're going to have an opportunity to opt out of the process. or any number of 25% or more of the neighborhood residents decide that they don't want permit parking, at that point, we will not implement permit parking in that neighborhood, and we'll recontact them at a later date to find out if they would like to implement the program in a separate way.
Thank you.
Mayor Sack, so I was the one that made the motion for reconsideration, and there was 3 areas that I thought we didn't deliberate on last time. So just to kind of start us off before public comment, I'm going to ask 3 questions to bring up the subject. So for staff, I guess the first question would be, the staff's recommending a 9 o'clock start, while your other zones, your olive zones and so forth, are a 7 o'clock start. Why is 9 o'clock start adequate to address this, especially if we think students may be coming in at 7:30 with a 9 o'clock start, and an hour and a half they can park till 10:30, so it gives them 3 hours to park. Why will this stop students from parking?
Okay, just a little bit of history. When the East Side was originally incorporated, when the parking management plan was implemented, all the residential areas on the East Side were created with a 9 a.m. start time, and it was 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Currently, Bella Vista, Villa Avenue, and Jackson Street are all 9 to 6 a.m. The olive zone in that area is 7 to 4. When Johnson Avenue and Crossway received their pilot program, it was implemented at a 7 to 4 time period. And so when Alpine was implemented as well, we remained consistent with Johnson and Crossway. And then when Whitney came on board, we did the same with Whitney to maintain consistency. As far as the 9 a.m. start time, we figured 9 a.m. would allow a little bit less privatization of the streets. It would allow people that didn't want to purchase a permit or people that were visitors to the area that were spending the night. It will allow them a little bit more time to be able to get to their cars without having to worry about receiving a citation. As far as the 9 a.m. as opposed to the 7 a.m. start time, it's not a deal killer for us. It was a recommendation trying to be considerate of those that didn't want permit parking. I understand and I'm sympathetic with the fact that this is a high school problem originally, and that 7 a.m. would be more appropriate, or possibly 8 a.m. would be more appropriate as a start time for the program.
If I could follow up on this one before I go to my next question. So I think I just heard you say you had some areas that have a 9 o'clock start, so you must have some data about how well the 9 o'clock worked in those areas.
We still currently have 3 areas, Villa, Jackson, and Bella Vista, that all have 9 a.m. start times. And I have not received any complaints from those areas. Okay.
Thank you. So if I could go to my next question. So for Alpine, they believe they have a summertime problem. Why does staff not think there's a summertime problem? In other words, they believe it's not just high school on Alpine that's an issue.
Correct. One of the comments presented by the Alpine community is that even if the high school parking doesn't present a problem during the summertime, they're worried about Parlor 308 employees parking there during the summer, which could be an issue. But when we implemented the program, we implemented so that we were able to take data and track data and then make changes throughout the program to make recommendations that if there were repercussions or if parking impacts were felt by the Alpine neighborhood without summer enforcement, we would modify that and change it and make it summer enforcement or address it another way.
So my third question maybe is sort of a follow-up to that. The Alpine neighbors believe the history of the parking problems on their street goes back before the high school problem sort of expanded. I guess it seems like at some point either maybe the closing of the gate behind the lodge so they couldn't come in that way, or the school size grew or something, but at some point in time the high school problem became much bigger, and they if we agree on that that's the case, they seem to think before that they still had parking issues. So my question for you is there a history? Do you know of a history, or wasn't described anywhere in the reports? It kind of your staff report started in 2016, I think, talking about what happened, not really the history. So is there a history of parking problems on Alpine that goes back before 2014, 2012, so forth?
I'm sure the residents could probably answer that a little bit better than me, since they live there and experience it more. It hadn't come to my attention prior to that, and part of that could have been because there was a different person in my position at that time. What I can provide is the fact that with the implementation of Cross and Johnson, it reduced some parking areas over in that area for the students to park, and that area, that whole high school area, or the east side area, which includes Alpine Avenue, felt an impact from that. That associated, I think, with the fact that within the last few years during that time frame as well, carpooling didn't become a possibility for kids because only one kid could drive for the first year of their driving. And so not only was there less area for the kids to park during that time, but there was more kids driving vehicles and needing places to park for that time, coupled with construction at the high school or less places for the kids to park at the high school. And so that's when we saw what happened with Alpine, the fact that Johnson and Cross received permit parking, and then it just got pushed over to Alpine Avenue, and Alpine Avenue was experiencing the impacts and all the negative effects from that. When we looked at Whitney, our intention was we can't just be looking at these as one-offs anymore. We have to see what it would do to solve the issue for a while to change the culture. And unfortunately, two surveys, independent surveys from each other, both said that about a half a mile or a 10-minute walk from the high school, expanding that zone would be an effective area. And so that's what we recommended, trying to alleviate the one-off issues.
So what I'm hearing is staff, maybe not having the history, believes that it was all a high school problem, and the Alpine neighbors have been saying, no, wait a minute, it's more than high school, it's also Parlor 360 or whatever it's called, and we just don't realize that.
I think a lot of it is we've worked extensively with Parlor 308 prior to even Alpine receiving its permit parking program, encouraging them to purchase employee permits for the area or to find other areas to park. And they were pretty successful with that. Not saying that Parlor 308 was not a significant issue in the beginning, possibly for Alpine Avenue. Before getting the program, it's my opinion, based from the discussions that I had with the residents, based on the complaints and the majority of complaints had to do with high school kids and the issues that they were causing.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question also, and then if the red curb that's currently on Alpine at the S, was that painted after the pilot permit parking went into place, or was that prior to the pilot and did not deter any of the fast driving in that area?
If I could let Director Morley respond to part of that, because it was his department that painted the curb.
The red curb was there prior to that, and we've done several things on Alpine over time, including a traffic calming project where we added the speed humps and did some management that way. So there's been community meetings to manage traffic and parking. I think the roadway's too narrow for parking where it's red now, so that's an appropriate management tool from our perspective. Also serves sort of the dual effect of discouraging business parking, because it just increases that walk up the hill. Whether that's totally effective or not, is something that time would tell, and measurement over a summer would allow us to do that evaluation.
Okay. Any further questions? Okay, so I will now open public testimony on this subject. I have several speaker cards. If you would like to speak, just submit it, and I'll go ahead and call each individual up. You'll have 3 minutes to speak. The yellow indicates that you have 30 seconds remaining. And when you come forward, if you could just identify yourself. First person is Bruce Mitchell. And after Bruce will be Linda Swenberg and then Jacob Swenberg.
I'll keep this very brief. My observations are that the parking was initiated, and parking control was initiated because we were getting our street commandeered by the high school by circumstances that they did not adjust to. We are not interested in privatization. It's a matter of having the right amount of parking in the right places. And for about 2 years, we did not have that when things peaked. Since the parking program has been in place, it's been very effective. The signs are up for 7 to 4. There's no indication the summer is on or off. And I guess my observation is that the program works, it's in place, and why change it? Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. Next speaker, Linda Swenberg.
Hello, I'm Linda Swenberg. I don't live in the area, but I have several children who've gone to Los Gatos High School or are there now, and I have to drive to that area, or they have to, from about 2.5 miles away in East Los Gatos. First of all, I wanted to just clear something up, but whether the parking time starts at 7 a.m. or 9 a.m. should not make a difference for the impact on high school parking, because students are no longer allowed to leave campus during the tutorial period, so until lunchtime, which is around noon, to go move their cars. So if you started at 9 with a 90-minute or even 2-hour parking zone, you would not have students able to park on those streets. Okay. I am pretty surprised that we've gotten to this point and the high school community has not been noticed of these meetings in particular. It has been only the community members who live in those neighborhoods. And I feel that, you know, we're a community that ought to be working together on these issues, and these decisions do impact everybody who uses the high school, and in fact impact everybody who lives in this town. Because when you limit parking and limit the number of students who can bring their cars to the high school, and you're asking for alternatives such as carpooling and things like that, you're going to increase the occurrences of parents having to drop off their students. And what that does is it adds at least 2 car trips, you know, from each family per day. Okay, so instead of the student just proceeding to the high school or the neighborhoods around the high school and leaving their car and not having to drive back out, okay, and then come in again at the end of the day, you're now adding in 2 significant car trips during a very high traffic time in the day. And I'm wondering if anything has been studied on this, not just from a parking issue and how the parking impacts the streets, but about the traffic flow, especially since for somebody like me, I have to pass through the traffic patterns of 3 other schools to get back home. All right? So that's something that I really think should be considered when you're looking at limiting parking to a half mile out. And I just want to go over a very personal issue. About 3 years ago, my family suffered a devastating trauma, which basically removed the parents, including myself, from being able to handle my children. And they had to operate with a lot more autonomy and independence. They did not all have senior parking permits at that time, and it became very difficult. And you should think about that.
Okay, I appreciate the comment. Any questions? Okay, thank you. Jacob Swinberg.
Hello, I'm Jacob Swinberg. You just heard from my mom. I'm a student at the high school, senior currently. I just wanted to supplement what she said with my perspective as a student. So first of all, I do kind of want to add to the question of, will the direction we're moving in actually help the fundamental problems with parking and traffic? Like the surveys that were given to students were mentioned, but I don't think in those surveys it was often asked if like the current situation is actually good. Like, I think the surveys certainly would show things about what students do, who walks to school, who can walk to school, those kinds of things. But I'd like to know what from that can give indication as to like what is the right walking time or whatever, especially since that is clearly something that could be very different for different people. And I also wanted to ask about I respect that the residents in the area have had a lot of issues with high school students. Myself, I've had bad experiences with really bad drivers and parkers from the high school. And but at the same time, again, with the direction we're moving, I want to question if this is really helping the issue or if it's just shifting where it's occurring to slightly different neighborhoods. So, for example, if restricting parking on Alpine might just increase traffic on Los Gatos Boulevard passing down that way, or if it increases the abuse of parking in those drop-off zones in front of the schools that aren't often enforced, as I see. And then also, and then adding to the thing of why wasn't the high school really worked with? I looked at the staff proposal for this stuff, and what I saw was that the council and such have talked with the residents in the area, but it doesn't seem like any administration or anyone from the high school was really worked with. And it seems like, I don't know, I'm wondering if there could be anything or if anything was ever attempted to be done in concert with the high school to reduce the traffic and the parking and stuff in that area. And working to find other solutions, because, I mean, as we've heard, this isn't just an issue like while school's in session. It happens throughout the year. So it's possible that high school students, while they are a big contributor, that fixing that won't necessarily solve the fundamental problem. Thank you.
Actually, I have several questions of you, if you don't mind, but Vice Mayor, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Sack. So thank you for coming and speaking to us. Sometimes it can be a scary proposition. So my question for you is, I think your mom said you live 2.5 miles away, so walking's not really an option. So you've got to drive or be dropped off. How far would you be willing to walk is really the question, because the high school doesn't seem like it's building parking lots as a priority. So if the town were to help solve the problem, maybe we could build a parking lot, but obviously it can't be very close by. So, if we put a parking lot somewhere that high school students could walk from, what's a reasonable distance to encourage you to park there versus closer on Alpine, for example?
So it's actually funny because when I was a freshman and a sophomore, I remember there were a few days where I was able to walk all the way from home to school when I didn't have after-school activities or anything. It was a long walk, and it wasn't always pleasant, but I could do it if I had to. But at the same time, this time of year for me and last year, a lot of the time, that really wasn't an option because I was doing after-school activities or I had to be in town for other things and for school things. And like walking home, 2 miles, which is like a 30 to 40-minute walk.
Took away your homework time.
It's a sink on my time, and it's not always. It's often not an option. So basically my answer is I think it could be very different from student to student what is that right walking distance.
Thank you.
A follow-up to that, and I hope you don't mind, it's just unusual that we have a high school student actually here. So, first question, and let me give you the context. When we were, and I'll say we, the policy committee was looking at this, one of our largest issues was how do we work with the high school, and we've been working with the principal and the superintendent as well as the Safe Routes to School committee to get more students to park at the Miles Avenue lot, because that is underutilized. And so staff did basically, it's either a 10-minute or a half-mile walk. And so first question, have you ever parked at Miles, and why is it that students don't like that parking lot?
So there was a long period of time where I actually did do that. I would drive my younger sister to school, or and so we would go early and we would park there. I think two things happen. First of all, students often just don't know that that's really an option. Like, I've talked to a lot of students and people are like, oh, like, I just didn't know that was an option. And I've heard the school try to promote it more. Like, one time on the school-wide announcements, they mentioned it briefly, but it's probably not, it's just not widely known enough. Second thing is it does fill up pretty quickly. So I might leave for school at 7:20 in the morning, and I get there and it's wide open and it's fine. But if I leave at 7:30 or 7:40 for school, and school starts at 8:10 now, or the first bell rings at 8:10, it might be almost completely full. So it just fills up super quickly, and students then think, oh, like, I just can't park there. People already parked there.
So the second question then to that is, how much does Safe Routes to School information at the high school trickle down to you as a student so that you're aware of the various efforts being undertaken by the town and the school to try and reshift the driving culture?
So, so I hear quite a bit of that, and and so personally, I know I've heard some of it is applicable to me, some of it isn't. So, like, I'm aware of when I can and can't park on Miles. But I know that, like, a lot of my friends or a lot of other students who go to the school, a lot of that information often doesn't go anywhere. And I don't want to badmouth the Safe Routes to School, because I know people who work on that, and they work hard and they do a pretty good job of getting out there, but there's some fundamental issue with how that information is ultimately given to students at the high school, because it's there and you can hear it if you want to hear it or if you're paying attention, but a lot of kids just don't pay attention. So
okay, and then my last question, again focusing on Miles Avenue. One of the ideas that we had was, should this be approved in some format, that this map then is shared with the administration, and in the Wildcats packet that you get in the summer, it's clear this is where you can park, where you can't, and please use Miles Avenue. If you had that in the beginning of the school year, do you think that would help, or is that another one of those things where it may trigger in your mind for, and there's no right or wrong, I'm just curious, what's the most effective way to get this across?
So it's good that you mentioned that, because I definitely think that's something that could help, because, as you may or may not know, that time of year is when people are considering whether or not they'll be able to drive to school and such. And sorry, I just want to quickly mention, I forgot to mention earlier, the other thing about Miles was sometimes there's really awful traffic going down Los Gatos Saratoga Road, and so if I often have to take that route to get to Miles, but I might not be able to if there's that traffic. So that's a really good idea.
Okay. Any further questions? Yes, Councilmember Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Sayok. I'm going to ask you questions related to the plight of high school students, such as you mentioned after-school activities, and on occasion you'll have sports and you'll have equipment. And in addition to your backpack with all your books that weighs 75 pounds, you have another backpack with sports equipment. And I don't believe you have lockers for everybody at school. Is that correct?
So we do, but some of the stuff can't be kept there. So, for example, I'm in band, and I need to take some of my equipment home from school to practice. So that's part of that. Or my sister does lacrosse, and so she can't stow her lacrosse sticks, at school and also have them at home always to practice. So those kinds of things. So we do have lockers for some things like, other clothes or whatever, but there are certainly a lot of, and I know those aren't the only two activities that have things like that aren't easily stored at the school.
So in other words, with no bus and virtually no parking for everybody, and if this guy's got a tuba and this guy's got a bass drum and someone's got a lacrosse stick and all those kinds of things, where do you stow your stuff? In your trunk of your vehicle, more than likely, on many occasions, I would imagine.
Yeah, it could be. Or it could just be in the back seat. But the point is, if I walk or bike to school, I can't really do that. I can't hold the handlebars and do whatever. If I'm walking to school, I don't have enough hands to hold that stuff.
So you mean you don't put the bass drum over your shoulders and ride the bike?
No.
So the other question was the topography. People take for granted that Los Gatos is perfectly flat and square, a grid system, and it's so easy to walk and ride bikes everywhere, but it actually isn't really that way. It's kind of like the high school's at the bottom of the drain, and everybody rolls downhill to get there. So the downside to that is you got to roll back uphill on the way out. But I guess you mentioned about 2.5 miles of distance. How would you describe your commute to the school? Is it hilly? Is it flat? Is it...
It's mostly hilly. So I live sort of up on that end near Shannon and such, and past Blossom Hill, and so it's mostly downhill to get there. That's not really the problem. I mean, if I'm just by myself, yeah, it's just the uphill. But I don't think that's a big issue. So yeah, it's mostly downhill getting there, and a lot of uphill going the other way. But I mean, anyone who wants to can just deal with it if they have to.
So my parents always used to say when I was a kid I used to have to walk uphill to school both ways in the snow or something like that. So in your case, if you were going to walk 2.5 miles with the tuba or whatever, you'd be breaking a sweat and it would be taking you a while.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know. Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Next speaker, Gwen Dawkins. And after Gwen, it will be Dirk Franklin and then John Thompson.
I'm Gwen Dawkins. I live at 79 Alpine Avenue. I've been a Los Gatos resident for 26 years and on Alpine since 1998. First, I'd like to thank you all for the dedication and long hours and a lot of consideration that you give us. I really do appreciate that. I am here today to express my disappointment and alarm at the sudden change in the Alpine parking program that we as a neighborhood worked so hard to achieve. All of us who live close to the high school do experience quality of life issues when our streets are congested or have been congested for 7 hours a day. I do feel for all of my friends and neighbors who live close by in the proposed high school zone. But I would like to point out that Alpine is different because it is one of the narrowest streets in the area. It is 24 to 25 feet wide. The county fire department would like 20 feet of unobstructed area to pass through safely. And when we have cars parked on both sides of our street, we don't have that. We have 11 to 12 feet. Because we also have curves, it's also impossible to see the whole length of the street, so you don't know if oncoming traffic is coming until you're there. This is all especially concerning to me because before I lived on Alpine, I lived on Fairview Plaza. And I lived there in 1997 when the Wood Road fire happened. I was not able to get to my house. I parked downtown because there was so much gridlock. I ran up to the neighborhood, and the house next door to me was burning down. There were firefighters trying to put out that blaze, and that house burned beyond repair. That is also one of the narrowest streets in town, and Firefighters spent the night on our street. The fire trucks are parked in driveways because the street was too narrow. So that was a very terrifying moment in my life. And that fire spread unbelievably fast. It was considered a small fire, but it was terrifying for all of us. We never know when disaster will strike, and Alpine is a feeder street to many other streets in the mountains. So it needs to be accessible at all times for the safety of all of us. With the newly proposed high school zone, students and commercial patrons can park there for 3.5 hours in the morning uninterrupted, which turns Alpine back into a single-lane road. I'd like you to reconsider any changes that you have in mind. We had a very highly successful and hard-won program.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you. Dirk Franklin?
Good evening. I'm Dirk Franklin. I'm at 79 Alpine Avenue. And I'd like to, since it's been a long meeting, get a show of hands from Alpine Avenue who's here today. So there's a few of us. Many of us couldn't make it due to spring break, but we have 29 of 29 residents on Alpine requesting that the restricted parking remain. We're semi-unified, I would say, as a street. The question is, why has Alpine parking been successful? Several reasons. The 7 a.m. start time. And you've seen the pictures of what happens when the students park there. But, you know, this journey got started just after the 2000s, right? In 2008, we came together and requested permit parking from the town because of Parlor 308. So that's documented. 2008, right? This has been a commercial parking issue. The students didn't show up till 2014, 2015, you know, as I guess the gauntlet got constricted here. You know, Los Gatos Lodge shut the gate. You know, that parking area there got turned off. A few other streets got turned off. That's fine. You know, we understand the high school is not really playing ball with taking up their end of the obligation and providing parking for the students, or even having preferential parking for people that don't live downtown, right? Or people that live in the mountains. I really feel for the mountain people because they come all the way into town and, hey, where do I get a park? So it's an issue. The 7 a.m. start time works well. I won't go into the details because I think you've been beat over the head with that. The commercial parking, again, starts around 8 o'clock. And with not having summer enforcement, they're going to be there all day. And they have up to 30 employees. And that, like I said, was the initial cause of why Alpine got unified to ask for restricted parking. Let's see what else I had to. So I think on Miles Avenue, you should have Miles Avenue parking and donuts. I think you'd get a lot of attendance there. And I'll throw in the first dozen. Beyond year-round parking, yeah. So just to reiterate, we like what we have. We appreciate what we have. It's not different from the surrounding areas. Villa is 7 to 4. That's a stone throw from Alpine. So I really ask you strongly to keep our program in place and really enable us to have our street back and eliminate the safety concerns and all the other things that you'll hear. Thank you.
Actually, I have a question of you, but go ahead, Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Sack. So we've met and discussed, and we haven't mentioned it tonight, so let me just put a little bit of context before I ask the question. Maybe it was talked about a little bit more last time, but part of what staff and the council is trying to do is create the most efficient way to implement a problem that seems like it keeps spreading from street to street to street, and to get ahead of that. And we're not trying to take away and send Alpine back to filled with cars. We're trying to see if we can fit it into something we can implement widely, so that it's more cost effective for us to do that. So staff earlier, when I asked one of my questions, said that they think they've found a way. They think they've worked with Parlo 308 to solve part of the problem, because part of Alpine's concern is it's not just the high school.
Correct.
So my question for you is, maybe comment on, do you think that there's other ways to solve Parlor 308, as staff mentioned, versus, extending the parking beyond what we would try to do for a high school zone?
Yeah, I don't think so. I've heard stories that Parlor 308 people go park at the high school. So I don't have a solution. I know prior to our restrictive parking and prior to last couple of years when the high school parking got to be more in crisis, it was a problem on our street. I don't know if they bought permits. It'd be interesting to pull the data from Parlor 308 employees and say, are they buying the permits? Are they parking in the olive zone as they should? Or whatever, that's fine. But I don't have a recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
My specific question, and I just need to clarify, you said in 2008 you began the permit parking process.
Yeah, we had a request in.
And so you actually began the paperwork in 2008. Oh.
Yeah, and maybe Pamela and Ernie was the leader of that effort.
Mr. Franklin, I could ask staff of that, but I just wanted that clarification.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
John Thompson?
Thank you for the opportunity for me to share my observations with my other friends on Alpine. I'm pleased and proud to belong to such a committed, caring community of neighbors, and I agree with and support all of their many, many, many letters and emails and face-to-face meetings with you in this regard. My Alpine Avenue issue is different, however. I had not asked for it to be included in the research because it is a private matter. But because I suspect it may also apply to other neighbors on Foster, Sunt, Cypress, and Turney, I ask tonight that you include it in your deliberation. I have a condition that requires an emergency rig from the fire department to take me to the hospital. Those rescue drivers could not possibly see the gauntlet of cars and trucks parked on both sides of the street until they reach the hairpin turn. It simply cannot be seen until they're right at it. Now, this is key. When they cannot continue up Alpine, they have to back their rig onto the boulevard and take the back route. That means up to Loma Alta, turn right, right again on Cross, left on Johnson, right again on even narrower Foster Road, and finally to turn on to top of Alpine where I live. It's hard to determine how much longer it would take to reach me, and having no advance warning of when such an emergency rig would be necessary, a serious delay could result in an existential threat for me and a litigation issue for the town. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Any questions? Thank you very much. Okay, Jeff, I think it's Galinas? And if you could correct me, that'd be great.
That's all right. It's my handwriting. I'm Jeff Gallinet. Okay. I'm going to summarize a few of the things that people have said so far, because we assume you've read the documents and had all the background. We've been working together with the town on this problem for a long time, as it was said, and we're trying to address commercial and school parking issues. And together with the unique characteristics of the street, they've been presenting problems for all of us for a long time, both the town and the residents. The NPP restrictions, which we worked together in this room about a year and a half ago, and were recommended and implemented by the town, they've been spectacularly successful. I can personally attest to that, not only in stories that you've heard, but in the general safety of the street and congestion. Both us and people who use Alpine have benefited from this as well. And the key reason that we want to keep these restrictions is that we've had a very successful pilot, and that pilot supports the unique needs of Alpine. Now, we understood that this NPP pilot was going to become permanent. We went through a process. We went through an evaluation period. We assumed that if it was successful, it would be implemented, and we followed every rule and process to the letter. That evaluation period ended late last year. the pilot was successful and should have been approved in our minds. And then without formal notice, it was removed in favor of the broader high school plan. We have no problem with a high school plan. We have an issue with that because we feel like we lost our due process in the process. But we're glad to be back here to be able to talk about it, so thanks for reconsidering. We know that we're not entitled to special treatment here, and we're not trying to privatize the street. We don't seek to privatize it. We want appropriate protection given the circumstances that are there. And we know that with parking rules, one size doesn't fit all. So many of us benefit from restricted parking. And people have mentioned the characteristics of Alpine. It's narrow, the blind curves, one thing that wasn't mentioned is the amount of people who go up and down the street to rest the town. So it's basically a through avenue that's relatively narrow with blind curves. We don't like the idea of moving from 9 to 7 o'clock when it's already there and invested in. We think that's a much more effective and logical solution. And we would like to see that, we think because of the commercial traffic and the general congestion and the need of the street, that a year-round program is much more appropriate. So, look, we'll hear you've heard some from other folks, you may hear from some more. But fundamentally, we think it's a unique case. Street has unique characteristics, that the current set of restrictions that we agreed and aligned with in the NPPP are the right ones for us, and they support the objectives of the town and the overall plan that you're talking about. That pilot was successful, the investments have been made, and we feel like we want to keep what we have.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you. Henry Richards?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Henry Richards. I reside at 118 Alpine Avenue. It's the upper third of Alpine, closer to Foster. Alpine is a throughway from Main Street, Los Gatos Boulevard to Foster. And if no one has noted already, this is a shortcut for kids going up the hill to get around the traffic at the stop sign. And we get a lot of through traffic on that, and we had a lot of problems with speeding, and the calming program has been very effective. I have little impact from the high school program where I reside, except for the fact that I lost 2 cats to speeders up and down the road, and I also had a very rude encounter with some young students, I presume, as I was trying to get out to a medical appointment with some obscene gestures and comments that I did not own the street. Since the restricted pilot program was initiated, there's been dramatic improvement. I think that's very clear. And I was happy to answer the survey that the town sent out, that I was more than satisfied with the program, and I was looking forward to the pilot being converted to permanent. So I was very surprised when a few weeks ago on the 21st, a neighbor of mine encouraged me to attend the council meeting because that had suddenly been rescinded and replaced by the high school zone program. Without any knowledge that I had, I downloaded all the information I could from the website and discovered that this new high school parking program was in fact going to be enacted. I noted with interest that the town in several instances had, throughout the process, instructed staff to inform neighborhoods, and further, the policy committee instructed staff to communicate the program to property owners. I would just like the record to reflect that in my instance, and in several of my neighbors' cases, no information was ever distributed. We had no knowledge of what was happening as the program was being developed. So we were not really notified or communicated. So I'm discovering now that the council wants to institute an area-wide parking program, nullifying our restricted program created after our strict adherence to all the regulations. And it was really, in my view, done without courtesy of information. We have diligently complied with all the requirements of the neighborhood parking plan program as it existed, and the pilot plan should have been made permanent, in our view. Nearly all of the Alpine Avenue residents and many of our neighbors up behind us believe that the Alpine parking plan ought to be permanent, and we are now here pleading for your reconsideration of this unique situation on Alpine Avenue to make it permanent. Thank you very much for your attention.
Any questions? Thank you. Okay, Julie Gallinet. And then afterwards, Steve Piasecki.
Thank you. I would like to address the proposed change referred to as the high school zone. And I just want to make 2 points, and maybe one of them is, we'll see. So if on the signage, like in the olive zone, you write high school zone, then you're naming the area after the problem, which was stated on a staff report. The high school zone is more descriptive or reflective of the parking compaction issues than east side, end quotes. So that does 2 things. One is while it might serve to simplify language for officials referring to the whole issue, which is good for the officials, it simplifies things for them, for residents or for anybody visiting the town, it implies that that's the place to park, especially if you're going for a school event. So it's confusing. And so for anybody visiting the town, it's misleading, it's confusing, and might even exacerbate the problem that it's meant to solve. Alpine residents, as you've heard, are opposed to being classified as a high school zone. We wish to be associated not with the problem, but with the solution. So if there is a change and it is considered a new zone, we'd like for that consideration to be made. The second issue is that given the unique characteristics of Alpine, which you've heard about, the blind curves, the relative narrowness, and it being a pass-through for folks living up Foster, and including all of the service vehicles that we and all of them require on a daily basis, there is no data that says the high school zone program will sufficiently address the problems that Alpine has faced prior to the current pilot, and that the plan may adequately address the needs of those other streets listed and for reasons just listed, not adequately address the needs of Alpine. So we have data that supports the adequate nature of the current pilot program. It's been highly successful. I think you will not find an unhappy person on Alpine because of its success. And so we are requesting that because it is so purposely meets our needs that we have it remain. Thank you.
Thank you. And Steve Piasecki? And I am pronouncing that correctly, I hope. Okay.
So my name is Steve Piasecki, and I live on Johnson Avenue. I am the third house down from Crossway. I didn't have a parking problem with the high school until the 100 block of Johnson got the permit parking along with Cross and along with Whitney. So we inherited it right then and there. And then, of course, Alpine needed it. The 100 block of Johnson needed it. They had a problem. Alpine had a big problem. I walked the neighborhood a lot and had witnessed it. So I support the concept that you're going toward now, which is a more comprehensive approach. None of the one-offs, and every neighbor has to come running into you. As soon as the neighbors next to them get it, they have to ask for it. So good idea, go for that. I think you ought to take another look at the option of going out through the lodge. In the future, whenever they redevelop, plan line it, have it, talk to them, tell them we're going to do this, so when a developer comes in and wants to do that, give the kids another option. That's a big cul-de-sac of parking spaces. Takes them probably 20 minutes to get out of there. It's easier to walk up to in front of my house and get in their car and drive out relatively unimpeded by traffic. I also suggest you take a look at some of the on-street parking in the commercial area along Main Street. Daytime, midweek, not a lot of demand. The angled spaces right out in front of Town Hall could become dedicated to student parking during the day. You don't need to really knock off a lot of spaces. You probably need to get 25% of the kids not driving anymore, like it was when my sons went to the high school, and we didn't have the problem at that time. I also think that it would be good to look at other creative ways. I have no idea if this would work, but if you give a kid, an ecology class credit for not driving, recycling, composting, eating real food, whatever you call it, teach them how to be good citizens. I mean, these kids have no clue, many of them. I mentioned that I compost, and somebody says, well, what's that? How do you do that? A younger person. So you're on the right track. I do have a problem with the concept of 25% opt out So the 75% majority, supermajority, can't get it because 25% opt out. I think that's what I heard. If I didn't hear that correctly, that's fine, but good work. Thanks. Any questions?
Thank you. Would you like to speak? Okay. If anyone else would like to speak, just please submit your speaker card. And why don't you go ahead and identify yourself?
I'm Mark Bisbee. I live on Pleasant Street, so I get a majority brunt of the high school students. I knew that purchasing my property. It doesn't, it's kind of the way of life now. I just know that there's going to be high school hours, either leaving the high school or coming to the high school. The drop-off program that you've done has really helped alleviate traffic on the street, and I appreciate that. I wanted to understand a couple aspects of the program because we currently don't have permit parking. So I wanted to understand who would be allowed to purchase the permits, how much they would cost, and I wanted to understand if it was mentioned, so it would only be during the high school year, but if we wanted it to extend in different hours, or if we wanted to extend throughout the year, because we have major problems when folks may come into town and they block my driveway or various things, if we could implement it year-round to do permit parking as well. So those would be three questions I have. And then solutions that I would like to see that I saw at my high school would be, we did permit parking. So every parking spot had a number on it, and that was your spot. And you bought it for like $20. And it went from the person who had the best grades down the list. And it's done. And so if you got good grades, you got to park. And it doesn't take money into consideration or bidding them off or all those crazy things. You got a spot, you got a tag that matched the number, and it's where you parked. So it didn't matter when you showed up. And then it sounds like the kids need bigger lockers for sports or something. So maybe you could look into that as well. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Bisbee. Lisa Roberts.
Thank you. First, I want to thank you for listening to us tonight, but I also want to thank you a year ago for approving our pilot program in the first place. I think this is, I know your job is very difficult, and you have a lot of choices to make and decisions to make, and I imagine that one of the difficulties is that there's not a lot of unanimity or not a lot of agreement in the community sometimes for your decisions because they're difficult decisions. This has got to be a pretty rare situation where Alpine Avenue, which is a narrow street but also a long street with a lot of people on it, are absolutely unanimous in liking what you put into effect a year ago. And we are equally concerned that it might not stay in effect. So far, I've heard no opposition from certainly no one at Alpine, but also no one anywhere else in the neighborhood or the town. There's no other person who's come in and said, no, I don't want Alpine to have its parking program, or I want it to be changed. So I think that's very important. The discontinuation of the NPPP would has also resulted effectively in kind of a retroactive discontinuation of Alpine's original parking program. There seems to be somewhat of a disconnect or between whether or not if an opt-out is done, whether or not there will be further consideration of alternatives to parking or alternatives to other kinds of parking permits. I've heard both things in the staff comments earlier. At the March 7 hearing, my understanding is that there was testimony by staff that non-parking permit alternatives for Alpine were considered, but it was determined that they would not be suitable. In other words, the only alternatives that really are suitable and workable are the parking permit programs that we have. Finally, on the commercial issue, the commercial issue was begun years ago, but I also want to point out that it was an express part of the current petition. The current petition, which I think was 2015, 2016, expressly referred to the Parlor 308 parking. The town recognizes that by having made an outreach to Parlor 308 to ask them to use residential permit parking. If the summer hours are changed, then at least for that period, and also in the morning, the Parlor 308 people will choose instead to do free parking on Alpine rather than pay for permit parking in other areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. Pamela, oh, I'm sorry, Catherine Knudsen, and then Pamela Nerning.
I'm Catherine Knudsen. I live at 25 Alpine, which is the second home on the left. And our home is kind of right where the red curb ends and then the street where everybody has parked until we got this program. I just wanted to make one point that there was kind of a curiosity about what might happen in the summers if, you know, would we have a problem. And we've lived in that home for 21 years, moved there in 1995, and the parking from Parlor 308 has been an ongoing problem. So I think that the parking, you know, that concerns me that we kind of say, well, you know, if that would absolutely not go away, like summers, it's more than the high school. And in fact, the high school kids have sometimes been very respectful and nice with my encounters with them, but it's been sometimes it's not even just necessarily the Parlor 308 salon people or it's clients, it's, you know, so I think that we can't just think that, oh, we're going to have nothing in place for the summer on Alpine because of the bottom of the street there. So thanks for all you do. It really is impressive to see what goes on in the town council. So thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay. Pamela Nerning.
Hi, Pamela Nerney. I live at 47 Alpine Avenue. Thank you for your forbearance, everyone's forbearance on being item number 12 and it being so late this evening. I will not, or I'll attempt not to repeat anything. I wanted to address a couple of specifics that came up. 2008 was the date of the petition from Alpine originally, and Lieutenant Langer was not in his position that he's in right now, so it was someone else. But I have a copy of all the signatures. I have a copy of the petition itself, and it was denied. And I forget what the vote was. Ms. Spector was mayor at the time. And it was specifically, there was some spotty high school, you know, football practice, whatever, but it wasn't the blown up problem it is now. But the town granted the license to this salon, which, as you all know, is a very high intensive employee parking and client come and go kind of business, according to their own website, 30 plus employees. So that was 2008. And in the summertime, as the proposal has been made for the high school zone, the summertime, that's a lot of employees that don't have anywhere to park. And it may not go all the way up the street like it had prior to our current program. But the bottom third, even the bottom half, I was going to say, even the bottom third, makes it that horrendously dangerous place that we all have been so relieved about not having. And lastly is that Los Gatos High School is the 900-pound gorilla in the room that isn't addressed very often, and I understand all of your positions and the carefulness and the restrictions that you operate underneath, but I have met one-on-one with the superintendent trying to put our issues on the table. I have gone to several, as have a lot of other Alpine residents, to Los Gatos High School meetings. So we do include them and have included them over time with respect and information, and had several good meetings, but they don't have the power either. They're academics, and they're trying to address the best education for our kids is pretty much the message we've gotten back. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, so I am going to close public testimony at this time. It's 9:48, and I'm going to call for a 5-minute break just so that we can stretch and take care of some issues before we get into deliberations. So if everyone can come back at 9:55. Thank you, everyone. If you could just be seated so we can begin deliberations. Okay. Before I open it up to council questions of staff, I do wanted to make a couple contexts. The larger context, as one of the two council members that sit on the policy committee, I do want to share the larger context that we were looking at and take away some of the heat that was directed at staff, because a lot of this was we were looking at how to figure out how to address high school parking challenges in a broader, holistic manner without the piecemeal approach that we had been seeing the past 2 years. When Alpine was given, as heard through the testimony, when Cross got theirs, the parking went to Loma Alta and to Johnson. And with each street that got permit parking, the problem just moved to another street. Those streets were coming in, and it was becoming cost-intensive, staff-intensive. And so the policy committee asked staff to develop a process so that we can identify how to address the parking situation, how to look at our own resources, and we identified Miles Avenue as a parking lot that we could help contribute to the solution, and how do we change the culture set so that students could park there and not be attracted by the residential streets that were closer than the half-mile walk. So that was the larger context and the direction in it we provided to staff. And again, the intent was to work with the high school, as we work with all the other schools, in reducing traffic congestion and trying to provide a better quality of life for the residents, but still try to help the students get to school in a manner that works for their own individual lifestyles. So I want to make sure that it's it's clear that this wasn't something staff just did on their own, but that there was direction, and that the direction was given with that context. Okay, so with that, I want to open it up to questions. Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I may have questions. I'm not sure yet. First of all, following up on what the mayor said, the goals of the policy committee and staff were very good goals. I think some of you said that already. That for something else that was said, there have been contacts between the town and the high school for years and years and years. But the issue is that the high school issues more parking permits or has more cars than it has more parking spaces, and the gap is increasing rather than decreasing. And so I have personally spoken with high school officials for a long time. With regard to the issues before us this evening, should someone up here begin to make motions, I am personally going to ask that we separate the motions and make them discrete, because what I realized from our last meeting on this issue and from the input that we've got received since then from the Alpine neighborhood is that I need to be really sure that the motion, excuse me, shouldn't eat candy at break, that the motion that I am voting on, that I know exactly what it is, and that we don't mush all of the motions together. So that's what I would ask of whomever decides to move forward with the motion.
Councilmember Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Sayoc. Dovetailing into what Councilmember Spector said, we had a beautiful program on Alpine Avenue that was serving the residents well, and they were very happy. And changing that is like painting a mustache on the Mona Lisa. I don't know why we would do that. So if I were going to make just one motion this evening, it would be to repeal and put back or replace the original program on Alpine Avenue. I don't know why we just can't listen to a unanimous call from the residents on that streets and do that first. So that would be one motion I would make right now.
Actually, I just need clarification. So you are making a motion?
Yes.
Okay. So if process-wise, before you begin that first motion, I need for you, if you so choose, to rescind the prior motion that we made so that we can then begin to make the series of motions based on tonight's discussion and deliberation.
Thank you, Mayor. I move that we repeal the previous motion made by council, the omnibus motion, and that is my motion.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so that motion passes unanimously. Now we have a clean slate, so to speak, and so you may begin.
So I move that we continue the current parking program as it is on Alpine Avenue. We don't change a thing. We just leave well enough alone.
And I'm going to second, but I want to make sure from what I said before that we're all talking about the same thing. So we're looking at 7 to 9 daily and 7 to 4 daily year-round and not called a high school zone. And if that's the what the maker of the motion is saying, that's what I am seconding.
Whatever the signs say now and whatever the program is now, leave it exactly the same as it is now. And that's what the motion is.
And I'll second.
Okay. Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to ask some questions. So this I feel like I'm peeling an onion and understanding this problem. And, even tonight, some things that were said that I realized maybe I don't even know all the facts. Could you tell me, so I'm trying to figure out how to ask this. The staff recommendation said to change, what was it, Alpine and Whitney to meet the high school zone. But I thought I heard that we have other parking areas, and actually said leave other parking areas, maintain existing parking permit areas. But earlier you made some reference to some other streets that had different parking times, and so are those not moving into the high school zone, and what are those streets and what are those times?
I would recommend that for purposes of the various motions that we're going to entertain this evening, that we stay focused on the Alpine motion that's on the table now, and then we can segue to how you want to proceed with the other streets, because there are some choices for you for the other streets. But with the motion on the table for Alpine, Monday through Friday, 7 to 4, year-round, don't name it anything, certainly don't call it high school. I think that's a discrete enough motion that you can take up, and then we can address the other streets if you want later.
Maybe I can simplify my question. So for me, part of the justification for voting for it is that it's not really the only special street zone that's there. I'm starting to hear that maybe there'd be some others, and in that case, why did we force that one into the high school zone if it's not really an only exception kind of thing?
Yeah, well, another approach is that the different yellow streets that are identified on the map, if this motion were to pass for 7 to 4 and all the other parameters, then we would recommend that all of the other yellow streets with existing parking, such as the portion of Johnson, Cross, Whitney, that those would also go to 7 to 4 year-round, so there would be consistency. Bella Vista and Villa and portion of Jackson, they're at 9 to 6, but that was an older parking permit program. But I think for all of the streets that are sort of south east of Los Gatos Boulevard, Main Street, if you want to look at consistency, we would recommend that all of those yellow streets follow the Alpine lead. And then as you consider your motions for potentially exploring new parking zones, that we would then use that same model for all the dashed line streets that are up for proposal. But I think having certainty for those streets that have gone through the preferential parking program, that this is the program that would then work for all of those, staff would be able to work with that.
So comment then on based on that answer, then what I'm hearing is staff is recommending, if we're willing, that we'll start with Alpine and build from it rather than making it really special. So based on that, then I can, that sounds like a good idea, so I can support the motion.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. What I hear from Ms. Pravetti from staff, that once we get through this discrete motion, this specific motion, that staff may want us to move on with, i.e. yellow lines, dotted lines. And so what I'll be asking of staff or any maker of motion is that you identify the streets and you identify the times, so that if we are moving forward, again, it's with specificity and clarity.
Okay, and my question before making a final vote, I understand the motion on the table. Could you just remind me, right now it's 7 to 4, 90 minutes, or only those with a residential parking permit can park there?
Thanks. So 7 to 4, Monday through Friday, 90 minutes without a residential permit. If you have a residential permit, then you can park there as long as you want during the restricted hours.
Okay, and it is all year round?
Correct.
Correct. And are there any other variations with what's in existence?
There is, and that's where Villa and Bella Vista and Jackson come into play.
Okay, so but we can address that after the fact.
We can.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So that motion passes 4-0. Okay. So thank you for the applause. It's always good to get applause versus boos, but I do ask that you just let us continue with the rest of the meeting. Councilmember Leonardis, you wanted to continue?
Thank you, Mayor Sayoc, and thank you for the public participation this evening. And, you know, looking at the root of the problem, we should always start at the root of the problem. Functional obsolescence. We have a high school parking lot that is, as Councilmember Spector described, is overbooked, oversold. We got a swelling population at the high school. We have no bus. We have kids that have to deal with topography issues, which make it challenging to drive cars, or to always ride bikes and whatever else with their equipment. We have really just, we have a couple access points to the parking lot at the high school, but only one exit. We have no, our community bus seems to be dwindling, our public transit. So these are all things that are the root of the problem, which leads to the problem spilling out into the neighborhoods and affecting what we call the quiet enjoyment and the quality of life of all the residents of Los Gatos. As was stated, this is a problem that has been going on for years and years and years in our community. So what is a solution to these problems? Solution to the problem is go by it street by street, which I called in a previous meeting trench warfare. Pretty soon I said the kids are going to be parking out at Lee High School to get to Los Gatos High School, because they have a big, beautiful parking lot with solar panels on the roof, as do most schools in the whole area. Or we can try to address the larger problem. I think it's time that this community, the town and the high school, really have to sit down and solve this problem. Someone mentioned the Los Gatos Lodge as a proposed solution, another access point. I've been a big fan of that idea for years. Another real estate concept besides quiet enjoyment and functional obsolescence is eminent domain. I don't know why we do not consider going and buying a portion of the lodge, or perhaps buying the whole lodge and putting in a community center and putting in more high school facilities, because we are obsolete. So let's think about these things in a broader perspective. In the interim, I'm so glad we had this public hearing. I'm so glad that this item was reconsidered, because this was one of those things that the policy committee considered it, but they consider it within their own vacuum. And when the community was brought in this evening, a lot of other ideas were presented, and a lot of other opinions were presented. And to have a one-size-fits-all plan for Los Gatos clearly doesn't work, in my opinion. To call something the high school zone and assume that that's what everybody wants for all these streets may or may not be accurate. And there also is the student perspective as well. These are public streets, and they do need places to park. And it's not just students, it's folks that use the high school during other occasions. I mean, we have festivals, we have summer events, we have all kinds of things. And we have to work within the confines of the problem that we have here. And we're trying to solve too many problems with one proposal. So I'm not really sure where I stand this evening, going street by street and saying this one can be 7 a.m., this one could be 9 a.m., this one should be, we call it the high school zone. I was going to call it the Monarch zone or the Wildcat zone or the Redwood zone. Be a little more creative than your property is in the high school zone, so don't buy there anymore, based on the public feedback. But I'm interested in hearing what the other council members have to say, because this is, although it was well intended by the policy committee, I think it's a bigger issue than it can even be had in one hearing. I used to despise going street by street and having the people do their votes and that kind of thing, and here's another street and here's another street. But now I'm starting to think that might be the best solution. I hate that is what's happening. It's spreading. I wish we would look at the bigger problem, as I stated earlier, but I'm hesitant to try to do a one-size-fits-all thing this evening. That's where I lay.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I agree with Mr. Leonardis. In addition, and the reason that I wanted us to make any motions discreetly rather than omnibus is that I do think these issues differ. For example, I would not be prepared to discontinue the neighborhood parking plan process. I do understand from staff and policy committee's perspective why that is being suggested, but we've already run into problems with making decisions when residents did not feel as though they were being noticed. And so to make a decision that impacts the entire town, I would not be prepared to do it. And so with regard to the proposed areas, the red area and the yellow area and the green area and the purple dotted line area, again, I am not prepared. I guess could be somebody on this council who could make this great motion and I'd be all behind them. But right now, as I'm sitting here, I just can't see that we should or could be doing that this evening.
So I'm going to weigh in, listening to the discussion tonight, and I think this goes to show how the process works and that there's various committees that ultimately feed into the council committee. And as I mentioned before, the policy committee began an idea. We asked staff to begin the legwork, and ultimately that decision is fully vetted here. What I'm also hearing is that it's a larger community discussion, and the fact that Jacob was here and we were able to get so many questions answered by a student makes me think perhaps maybe the next step is a community-wide meeting, perhaps a joint meeting with the high school so that we can vet some of these issues. We can develop the best parking plan in the whole world, but if the students don't use it, it kind of defeats the purpose, is what I'm hearing. And I still think we need to look at the problem in a larger context. This one approach, it does push the problem out. And yes, the pilot worked for Alpine, but then it didn't work for the street after that and the street after that. And from a staff perspective, I understand the resources it takes to vet each street one at a time. There's no right answer. I'd love to hear the other council members' feedback, but it's a larger issue that we just have to tackle, and I don't think we can just wait until each individual street approaches us at a time. And if it takes another joint meeting with the high school, I'd be happy to offer that invitation, but I do think we have to address it sooner rather than later because the problem is not going to go away. Any further comments? Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm not sure my comments are completely formed, but I'll give the few I have. I definitely appreciate the goal of trying to get ahead of the problem, and I feel like we do the community a disservice doing it one street at a time, because then the next street that the parking issue moves to, they have to go through pain, and they have to realize, oh, geez, we got to go to the town and complain, and we got to start a process. And I feel like we're doing the neighbors a disservice by not trying to get ahead of it. So I definitely appreciate the idea of trying to get ahead of it. I kind of bit my tongue a little bit at the part of the idea of what we did is let's restrict all the parking, and it'll force the high school students to change their habits, I guess, is the idea. And it kind of grated on me, but I didn't say very much, that it's maybe not the best way to do it. And I think there's other things to be considered, and I like your idea of maybe getting some more feedback from the high school students. I think the first thing they're going to tell you is, please don't take our parking away, but somehow you're going to have to tell them we need to do something and maybe have them help us solve the problems. I think one speaker made the comment tonight that, what about those poor mountain residents? If they're not the first ones down here, they don't get to park. It seems to me part of the solution, and I keep thinking, we've tried to work with the high school, and they're as Councilmember Spector said, she's been working with the high school for a long time, and we're not getting closer, we're getting further away, I think, as was mentioned. But there's other, like I said, so I keep thinking, well, can we come up with some other parking areas that we have available that we can give special permits that you can apply for, like if you live in the mountains or you live especially far away, so that the people that really need to drive can actually get parking? Because what we've designed is there's no solution for somebody that lives in the mountains and we've taken away all the parking, and maybe they've got to race down here and beat everybody to Miles Avenue. It seems like it's not completely hatched idea. So those are my thoughts.
I'm going to make a couple comments, and I'm going to actually ask Director Morley if he knows the answer. I do feel like I have to defend the high school a little bit because they have been changing. It may not be as quick as we want, but I do know, and I'm going to look to Director Morley and Jacob, our resident expert here, that they've been limiting more and more parking permits. This year, I believe it was only to seniors, and that with the construction, they are looking next year at looking at distance radius. So I think they are looking at how to alleviate that gap between spaces and permits. It's not quick enough for all of our needs, but I agree we need to have solutions, and I think Miles Avenue, because it's a town lot, we were trying to kind of pressure and funnel students there. But Director Morley, am I wrong in the Safe Routes to School efforts? They have been trying to look at who gets permits. Is that correct?
That is correct. The high school has been very conscientious on issuing permits to with criteria, especially to seniors, and then to some need considerations as their parking supply continues to dwindle. I think it'll dwindle a little bit more next year, and they'll need to continue to do that, which in turn leaves additional need for parking elsewhere.
And so the specific question I have to staff is, do we know what that delta is of if they look at criteria of the mountain students or those that are within a certain distance that realistically cannot walk or bike or use the bus, do we know what that number is of how many they've identified in need of a space and how many spaces they actually have?
We don't have that number. We can work with the high school to get it. It does fluctuate over the course of a year, right? Sure. As the sophomores get their licenses and there becomes more that are driving. But we can talk to the high school about what their unmet demand is on campus if they have an idea of what that is.
Okay. Further comments? Councilmember Leonardis?
It seems like there should be some state law which would require them to accommodate everyone on their campus. I mean, here we have a situation again where the facilities are from the 1930s, and it's like, come on, upgrade. You can't expect people to, as we stated, come down from the mountains, come down off of Shannon Road with equipment and everything else. I appreciate the Safe Routes to School and all the work that's being done, but it's pretty obvious at this point that everybody is either going to walk or ride their bike or whatever, and I think everybody's aware of that as being a great option. But the ones that have to drive. And we're at a problem now. We're at a critical point where the ones that are starting to spill out into the neighborhoods are doing that because they just have to do it. So I think it's time that the council and the high school, we have to have this meeting, and we have to come up with a plan to address this. I mean, their facility is outmoded. That's the root of the problem. Let's get it back into mode.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Sack. So the one of your comments actually worries me a little bit more. You said the high school is now limiting its permits, which means that's not going to stop the kids from driving. It just means they're not providing the place for them to park. So that makes it even more important that we hurry up and protect our neighborhoods, which doesn't solve the problem either. It just protects our neighborhoods. It seems to me, I think some sort of shuttle, and we're working on the traffics program. I don't know how far in the future that really has to be, but there's got to be parking lots around the town. Like maybe Calvary Church doesn't use theirs during school hours, for example. But I think as Mr. Leonardis was digging into earlier, kids can't necessarily walk a distance if they've got to carry their tuba and their lacrosse stick and so forth all at once. So some kind of town-provided shuttle program. We know the schools can't provide it because now they have to bus everybody, and they can't be selective. But we as the town, if we get our traffics program part of it, we could decide we'll run shuttles to certain parking lots, park and ride lots, and some of those places to so that kids don't have to just walk. Even 10 minutes could be a hassle if you're carrying more things than fit in all your arms. Would Mr. Morley like to talk more about traffics?
We can talk about traffic and parking theory and for hours probably. So if you look at some of the big cities where take a New York City where there is no parking, somehow the kids get their tubas to Band and back. So there are alternative methods. The parking theory currently is to not meet the demand, and through not meeting the demand, you force alternative methods of transportation, including carpooling, car sharing, use of transit, walking, that kind of thing, multimodal transportation. In terms of traffics, we are actively pursuing that. It's going to take us some time to put that in place, so don't expect it for this coming school year. If it's the year after that, we'll be doing really, really well and trying to put something together. When we talked with San Leandro about their program, they took a number of years to get their program in place. So it's quite an endeavor, and there's some work to do on that. VTA is changing their bus routes. That looks like with the impact of some good lobbying on the town's part, that's going to continue to serve even potentially on a greater frequency the high school. So there may be some opportunities there for some encouragement. The idea with miles, and it's probably still a good option, is to provide a 10-minute walk that still meets the need, and perhaps, as Jacob mentioned, increased outreach in partnership with the high school could help us to do that encouragement there. One of the things we'd be happy to see is that there is no capacity at Miles, and if we get there, I think that's a great problem to have, and we'll take it to the next step and look for the next alternative. But at this point, driving through that location on a daily basis or multiple times a day, there's capacity 24 hours a day. So there's some room there. Lots of things to talk about on parking. Certainly engaging the high school is one of those options, and we'd look forward to continuing that discussion.
Councilwoman Spector.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The good thing about a meeting like this, where you sort of get off point, you're not going through all of the proposed motions, but you're thinking and you're talking, is that ideas do come up. And what I'm hearing is that it may not be fast, but we need to explore, we need to get more information. I realize that we're not going to have the subways of New York City taking our students from the hillsides into downtown Los Gatos. I get that. But we couldn't be the only school district in school in the world, in California, in wherever, that has more students than they do parking. You're saying that Lee has plenty of parking. I think that's what you said. So we need to get ideas from other locations. Obviously, we need to work with the high school. We have done this before, and we haven't been successful. Maybe it is shuttles, maybe it is buses, maybe it is on demand. I don't know. Maybe it's driverless cars. They can just drive themselves home. I don't know. But there are things that are happening. We need more ideas. The high school needs more ideas. And I thank the policy committee for at least getting us to start thinking about these issues.
Thank you, Mayor Sack. So I feel like we're leading towards not making any more decisions tonight and asking for more ideas. But if we do that, I want to understand what we're leaving unprotected. If I look at the map up there, all the yellow is protected, correct?
No, because of the rescission of the decision from March 7th, you need to decide whether or not you want to continue permit parking for Whitney Avenue.
What about all the rest of the yellow?
Those were established prior, so those will remain in place.
So if we do nothing, Whitney still has a pilot, right?
No, the pilot would go away. It would end. So you need to decide on Whitney because it was a pilot concurrent with Alpine.
So if I could sort of finish the question before Mr. Leonardis. So there's areas that are just purple up there. Those are left unprotected. So if I look at Loma Alta, Stacia, Los Gatos Boulevard, Pleasant.
Yes, those would remain unprotected without a comprehensive solution, and they would just stay as they are today without any permits. And we would essentially stop all work because this is not a strategic priority. This would essentially go dormant until the next time we do strategic priorities and council says, we want to pick this up as a strategic priority.
Council Member Leonardis and then Spector.
Thank you, Mayor Sack. Because Whitney and the pilot program was born of the neighborhood parking program process, I think that should be a separate public hearing where we get the data. We go through the same process that we did with Alpine and the other neighborhood parking programs and let them come in and have their voice.
Actually, if I may, we did outreach to them and they would like to continue as well with their permit parking. They were fine with, either hours or whatever. So I think, and we would think they've already gone through the entirety of the process. They've gone through the pilot. So we think just to give them the same courtesy that we gave Alpine. They're obviously a different neighborhood, so they've chosen to express themselves differently. But I think in fairness for them having gone through the entire process, they really should be that staff would recommend that they are granted the same parking permit program that they enjoyed during the pilot.
Councilwoman Spector.
Thank you. To staff, is Whitney the only other street that has requested permits and gone through the process?
They are the only other street that has had an approved petition that's been accepted that has a pilot implemented.
And what are the specifics of Whitney in terms of days of the week, hours, year?
They are identical to Alpine, except that they requested that they did not need summer enforcement.
When you say they requested, did somebody say that? Did they revise their application? How did that information get to staff?
So during the permit process, we meet with the neighborhood to establish what type of restrictions are going to be established in the permit zone. And so we come together with our recommendations and with the residents' recommendations to try and reach some collaboration on it. They agreed, and in their request during their petition, they said they recognize that they were only receiving compaction during the high school or the academic year. They were requesting a 7 to 4 Monday through Friday, 90-minute parking restricted without a permit during the academic year.
Thank you.
Councilmember Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Sayoc. It's interesting. I didn't receive one written piece of correspondence or anything from Whitney, so I'm hesitant to go forward with a decision on that this evening. Also, with the Alpine parking program, one of my key points in making the decision to allow that was the safety because of the topography of the street. I had been down that street on a number of occasions when it was driving through a gauntlet and you could not get a fire truck through there. There was one speaker who said he needed that type of assistance. So without hearing anything else on Whitney this evening, I'm kind of hesitant to move forward with anything on that. I appreciate staff's input, but if we are ultimately or should ultimately in the future come up with some greater parking plan, which I don't know which way we'll be headed in the future, perhaps it could be included in that time. So that's just my thoughts.
Okay, I'm going to actually make a motion to keep Whitney's pilot program and make it permanent. And I respect the fact that they did not participate in this round of public comment, but Whitney was the first street that felt the immediate impact once Alpine received their parking permits. And I do feel that they did, just as Alpine did, go through the process and were outreached and did communicate, not through us, but through staff, that they would like that made permanent. That I will make the motion that their parking permit from 7 to 4, 90 minutes, but not be enforced in the summer as requested, be made permanent as well. Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor Sack. I'll second that motion because I think the citizens of Whitney, residents of Whitney, said they saw, okay, you're going to change it to what you're calling the high school zone. Yeah, we're fine with that. We don't need to come get upset. And I don't want to just cancel their program and wait for them to get upset. That doesn't seem like a good process to me. So I'm going to second your motion.
And I want to make sure I'm looking at staff. That are there any other specific details that I need to incorporate into my motion that so that what they are currently experiencing can be made permanent?
No, I think you're okay. Monday
Okay.
through Friday, academic year, 90 minutes restricted without a permit.
Okay. Councilmember Spector?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to support the motion, although I do share Mr. Leonardis' concern because I noticed the same thing. At this point, I understand that all of the areas have been notified about this meeting, and I received all these emails. You sent a lot of them, and they were all from Alpine, and I got nothing from, Whitney. But I will go ahead and support the motion because the worst that can happen is since I'm supporting it, I can always do a motion for reconsideration. And I know staff is going to love that. All right, so I'm supporting the motion.
Okay. I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously 4-0. And what I do want to, before we consider no more motions, I do want the council to give thought on the neighborhood parking plan process. And the recommendation at this time, at the last meeting, was to discontinue it. And the reasons for that is because the policy committee felt that until we have clear criteria of what we're looking for in providing parking permits, whether it's safety or whether it's to alleviate high school, there's no rhyme or reason to the neighborhoods that are seeking parking permits. And at that time that this came forward, we were thinking of a moratorium or a discontinuation. And I throw that out for consideration because, as Ms. Pravetti said, this is not a priority, but yet each time a neighborhood comes forward, it is going to be significant time and resources of staff. And I think they need direction on how to move forward. Councilmember Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Sayoc. I would recommend a moratorium, at least until the town, the council, the high school, we all get together and look at this problem more globally, more holistically. I just don't think it's reasonable to go street by street moving forward like this, because again, as was stated over and over, we're not really eliminating the root of the problem. We're just causing the problem to move further up the hill. There's going to be a certain amount of people that absolutely have to drive at this point, and that's all there is to it, and we have a facility that can accommodate them. So we can try to change their behavior, but we're not going to. You can only force so many people to change their behavior. How many of us rode our bikes to work in San Francisco this morning? Raise your hand.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor Sack. So I guess my question is there any if we put a moratorium on this, is there any process for residents of one of these blocks that have, just had it to get, now they can't start the process, but is there some way for them to get the information into staff or into the council that this has now become a problem in our street also, so that it's understood.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're always open to resident input. Our community is great about raising concerns to our attention, and if any of the streets with the dashed lines wanted to come forward and express their concerns, we would take that under advisement. I know our town attorney had to leave a little bit early, and I think if he were here, he may wordsmith a little bit the notion of moratorium, because I think there are some legal requirements in terms of urgency and emergency that would have to be made in order to suspend our regulations. But I think, maybe a temporary pause. There's another word for it. I'm not the legal eagle that Rob is, but I think there is a way of suspending it while still being open to input from the neighbors.
Perhaps moratorium isn't the best word, but perhaps a 6-month freeze.
Any further comments? There's no second. So I'm actually going to second the motion. And further discussion, Councilmember Spector?
I will not be supporting the motion. I am concerned that we are doing this pause, emergency stop, whatever we want to call it, without once again getting the input of all potentially impacted neighborhoods, residents. It could very well be that the reasons that folks have for wanting a permit, permit parking in the next 6 months, are not really important, or we may not think they're important, but right now we don't know what that is. So for those reasons, I will not be supporting the motion.
Vice Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor Sack. So I appreciate the Mrs. Spector's comments. On the other hand, I think 6 months is not very long. If they were going to start something, it would take longer than that before they would do it. So a 6-month pause is, I think, not unreasonable. It would not be long before 6 months is up, and either we've figured something out or they can now start the process. So I'll support the motion.
Member Leonardis?
I just want to comment on the concept of 6 months. Gives everybody a time to take a deep breath and really think about this. It also gives us an opportunity to express our urgency, because everybody's kind of on hold for the next 6 months until we make contact with the high school and try to solve the problem more globally. And I know, again, we've reached out to the high school over and over and over again, but let's get really, really intense this time.
Okay, I have my intense face going. Okay, Vice Mayor.
So one more comment or question. So what I heard staff say is this is not a strategic priority. We're putting it on hold, but it seems like we're putting it on hold and we're assuming something's going to happen. But I also heard staff say they're not going to do anything. So is there something missing here?
I think, the whole point of having strategic priorities that it helps the organization, align to the things that you would like us to focus on. So we're investing a lot of time on Measure B. We're going to be hiring a new transportation manager, so that way we can position ourselves better through that process. We're trying to maintain service levels in other areas. We're working on a lot of different other land use areas. So, so there are trade-offs. If, there's a need to really look at this more carefully, then we're going to need to think of, what are the resources that are going to be needed. It would take some amount of work to work with a high school to pull together a joint community meeting. And that part of it is relatively simple. It's really the follow-through, because then we will have created a lot of expectation on the part of the student body, the parents, et cetera. And I would just caution about, and I think it's great, we'll continue to coordinate with the school, but I think at some point, as our town council, we would just ask, how much of the high school parking problem is it the town's to solve? And so obviously there's some push and pull there, and I think you've all been very gracious in terms of trying to help the high school solve its problem, but I think we also need to see what is that partnership really going to look like? Because I see all of you taking a big shoulder to that issue, but I think we really need to have some frank discussions with our partners before we commit too much. So we were trying to think of what's a holistic solution that might help address the quality of life that is within our purview of town streets. But there may be other solutions out there, and we're certainly open to it. And if the next step is a high school meeting, I think we would just need to be very thoughtful about, well, what are the follow-throughs and what are we going to do with the ideas? So it's just kind of thinking ahead a couple more points.
And I appreciate that. Vice Mayor and then Councilmember Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor. So if we continue along that, what we seem to be suggesting is we're going to put a freeze on it, but we're not going to do anything. 6 months doesn't sound like the right amount of time because we're not going to do priority setting for 9 months. So I would think 6 months is not the right number. It needs to be 9 months, or we do something different.
Actually was going to make that same point. Councilmember Leonardis.
Thank you, Mayor Sayoc. Based on what the town manager said, I don't know if we're going to get all the answers this evening to this great problem. So maybe we could, we just have to explore the 6 month versus 9 month versus 1 year ideology. I just want to emphasize the point, though, this one point. This is a community problem. It's a quality of life problem for everyone within a certain radius of the high school. It's not just a high school parking problem. It is really our problem because it's spilling over. It's also detrimental to the learning environment at the high school, which affects our property values as well. So I think it really is an urgent matter. This started out as a simple policy committee recommendation, and perhaps it is morphing into a strategic goal in the future. But I think just to try to get the conversation started, drag everybody into the high school auditorium for one evening and brainstorm and try to get some things down on paper would not be a bad idea. Can that happen in 6 months, 9 months, or whatever? I'm not really sure. I just want to emphasize the point that this can shouldn't continue to be kicked down the road any longer. It is a town problem, in my opinion, emanating from the functional obsolescence of the high school parking.
If I may make a suggestion to the maker of the motion, if we could amend it so that the temporary pause be extended until our next priority setting session, just so that it's clear for staff, given the current priorities that we've listed for the year, where this falls. And I agree with the managing expectations. To convene a community meeting, we better be able to actually be clear what we plan to do with all the feedback that's elicited. And perhaps the next step we make is through our regular meeting that the mayor has with this principal and superintendent that previous mayors have had, bring this up as another item. It has been discussed, as Councilmember Spector said, but relay the urgency to it with the clear understanding that this is something that both organizations need to be fully committed to. So if the maker of the motion would consider amending it so that it would go from 6 months to the next priority setting session?
Yes.
Okay. And a seconder, I second. Any further comments? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It passes 3-1 with Councilmember Spector dissenting. And so we've discussed a lot of things here, Ms. Pravetti. So if you could just bring us back to what were the decisions made. And legally, I know Mr. Schultz is not here, but a reminder that this is a reconsideration, so we can no longer reconsider this. Is that correct? Or how does that process even work once it's been reconsidered once?
Okay, so the reconsideration of the March 7th decision, which was a single motion, the first action that you took was you repealed that March 7th. So that is now off the table. The second motion that you had was the Alpine Avenue to keep it as it was during the pilot that passed. The third was to do something similar for Whitney, and so that one passed. And the fourth motion was the freeze on the neighborhood parking plan process until our next priority session. So now there are 4 new motions, and under the rules of reconsideration, because these are all very different motions from what you did in March, it is possible that you could do reconsiderations on these 4 distinct items or anything else that you considered at this evening's council meeting.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, with that said, thank you very much. Meeting's adjourned.